a good meeting. Can I welcome members, officers and the public here in the gallery or watching on the webcast to today's meeting of the Environment Committee. Please may I remind participants in the room to turn your phones off or put them on silent, and can I also ask members and guests to ensure that any electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones. Can I ask the clerk to confirm any apologies for absence?
Chair, no apologies for absence have been received, but I'm expecting 2 members to join remotely, namely AMs Cooper and Best.
Thank you very much. Section 2, Declarations of Interest. Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? And can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in specific items listed on the agenda? Thank you very much. And I see no indications. Section 3, Minutes. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the last meeting of the committee held on 15th of November 2021 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Section 4, Summary List of Actions. Can we note the ongoing and completed actions arising from previous meetings of the Environment Committee? Thank you very much. Section 5, Climate Adaptation and Risks in London. That now brings us to today's main item for discussion, which is climate adaptation and risks in London. This is our second meeting focusing on this topic. Can I start by welcoming our guests here in the chamber at Union Street? We have Shirley Rodrigues, who is the Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy, and Catherine Barber, Assistant Director for Environment and Energy here at the GLA. And I'd like to start by handing the floor to Shirley, who's going to give us a 5-minute opening statement.
Good morning, Chair, and thank you very much for that introduction. A lot's changed since I last sat in front of the committee in person a couple of years ago now, and obviously we're still going through the trials of the pandemic. But during that, the Mayor has continued to press on with his ambitions to make London a zero-emission, zero-carbon, zero-waste city, one that is the greenest in the world. The past couple of months have shown really this ambition coming to fruition in a couple of areas. For example, in November, we've just expanded the existing Central London ultra-low emission zone to 18 times its original size. And last week, we published our 1 month on report that is showing already the huge changes that it's brought into effect, and that will have a huge impact on Londoners. The first month of operation has seen compliance rates of cleaner vehicles of around 92%, and this compares with a compliance rate in the same area of around 39% in 2017 when we confirmed the introduction of the scheme. And on average, there are 47,000 fewer older, more polluting vehicles in the zone than in the 2 weeks period before the launch, and 11,000 fewer vehicles overall, meaning ULEZ is encouraging a mode shift to the cleaner forms of transport, but also to transport modes such as walking, cycling and public transport. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit longer before we have data for how this is impacting on air pollution, but we expect the ULEZ expansion, along with the tougher standards we brought in for the low emission zone, to reduce NOx emissions from road transport by around 30%. And that's going to also save 100 kilotons of CO2 emissions, which is equivalent to taking 60,000 cars off the road. And alongside all of this, we continue to tackle the climate and ecological emergencies. You may have seen today we've announced a 600,000 Rewilding London Fund to help address the nature emergency that we're facing, starting to help restore wildlife to London in our key sites of nature importance. But we've also announced 45 community projects that will connect more Londoners to green spaces, improve resilience and improve water quality. These major achievements come alongside a host of other activities that I'm sure we can cover in more detail in the session, but I'll just touch on a couple. For example, the Mayor has added a further £30 million of funding to the Mayor's Energy Efficiency Fund. This is going to leverage up to £150 million of private sector funding for green projects across London. We planted over 350,000 trees, with another 65,000 committed by March 22. And this includes 2 woodlands, one of which I attended the opening of early this month up in Enfield. And we've been working with London boroughs to attract even more funding into supporting the retrofitting of our homes and workplaces, both to tackle carbon emissions, but also to tackle fuel poverty. And that's around £180 million worth of funding going into that retrofit revolution. All of these achievements feed into the Mayor's overall aim for a Green New Deal for London, and using the city's environmental credentials to guide our recovery from the pandemic, and meet our targets of doubling the green economy and becoming net zero by 2030. We've been focusing, for example, working with London boroughs, housing associations and stakeholders on retrofitting London's housing stock, and we'll be hosting a retrofit summit alongside London councils to bring these stakeholders together and talk about some of the actions we want to accelerate together. We are developing plans for a green financing facility, and we hope to be announcing further progress on that in the new year. And following the successful launch of the ultra-low emission zone, we're going to be looking at the few remaining areas in London that aren't meeting legal NO2 limits to improve the air quality there, but also consider how the WHO tighter PM2.5 targets can be met in London. None of London obviously meets those areas, which brings huge health impacts to Londoners. And of course, I'm going to end, but I just wanted to touch on COP. As part of the work to prepare for COP in Glasgow earlier this year, where the Mayor became chair-elect of the C40 network of global cities, we did a number of events and hosted a number of announcements to really showcase what London is doing, but also the important role of cities in doing and not delaying. This is a message that the Mayor, as chair of C40, but as a member of the M10, member of UK 100 and others, is really hammering home. That we need to take action fast. We're in this decade of action, but we also need to embed social justice at the heart of our actions as we tackle the twin dangers of climate change and air pollution. So just to end, I just wanted to thank the staff in the environment team and the rest of the GLA and the functional bodies, and also all the stakeholders in London who've helped work with us to improve London's environment over the last few years. We made huge progress, but there's a lot more to do. The pandemic has obviously highlighted huge areas of inequalities that we are seeking to address. And I look forward to getting into a bit more detail on these and to work closely with the Assembly to accelerate our activity in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. So if I can begin with this summer, we saw some of the worst floods that London's ever experienced, and the Mayor convened a series of roundtables. Could I ask what were the conclusions of the roundtables and what action will now be taken?
So we held a series of roundtables starting, following those incidents in July. They're co-chaired by myself and Deputy Mayor Fiona Twycross, who is the resilience lead and obviously leads the London Fire Brigade. And there are two parts to the roundtable. One is the sort of immediate emergency response. How do we deal with the way that services, local authorities and others came together to help respond to those incidents and how people were affected by them. But also the bit that I'm leading on is, how do we also work with local authorities, the government, the Environment Agency on the longer term impacts of climate change and in particular surface water flooding. I should start just to clarify, obviously we are already experiencing the impacts of the climate change that we have induced as sort of anthropogenic climate change. So it isn't possible to eliminate the risk, but what we're trying to seek is to make sure that we plan and really understand how we can tackle these things in the future. And one of the things that we have implemented as an emergency response is, for example, working with Thames Water to address the capacity of their call centres, to make sure that they're able to deal with people calling into them, working with the London Resilience Forum on how we might understand what the emergency response was, and they conducted an expedited review which came out with a series of recommendations, including how we can improve better real-time communications between the various agencies. And those are things that are being looked at and being implemented now. Better communications, for example, to people. For example, you may have seen that people were driving through flooded subways or underpasses, which is really, really dangerous, and not sure how we managed to escape it, but there was a sort of pretty potential for fatalities, essentially. So part of the work that we did through the London Flood Awareness Week, that we also run alongside the Environment Agency Flood Awareness Week, is to remind people of what sort of actions they can take to prepare for incidents like that, and to be careful and not to drive through, not to risk their life and limb really for driving through such incidents. One of the biggest issues, though, that was being raised is the lack of a coordinated strategic plan for London. And that's partly because there is no single authority with responsibility for a plan in London. The government's the act that governs this is 2010, identifies a series of flood risk management authorities. The mayor is not one of those. The local authorities are. Transport for London is for its roads. But there are a series of agencies and organisations, all with different responsibilities. And whilst there have been some plans and some coordination, I think it's fair to say that there isn't a single good enough coordinated plan. And that's really what we've been working on through the roundtable, to advocate to government to try and clarify that situation, but in the meantime to work with those agencies to make sure that we have a better coordinated plan for London. The other issue is funding as well. Flooding, there is some mechanism for supporting flooding from the river or from coastal flooding, but actually surface water flooding has been the poor relation, and this is really what we're seeing much more, because of climate change. The Mayor has done some work on this, providing funding through his green funds to support, for example, resilience, the funding that we announced today, is looking at how do we improve green spaces to capture rainwater, to take in surface water runoff. Some of the work that we've been doing through the London Plan in terms of policies that we have for new development. These are all things that we can and have been taking action on, but certainly we need much more funding to help local authorities really address the sort of surface water issues in their areas.
It's good to hear you be so clear that we were fortunate to avoid those potential fatalities, because as I'm sure you'll know, in Germany we had those tragic deaths, and this was the same weather storm here in London. So in many ways we were just fortunate that we didn't have much worse effects. Do you think the scale of the flooding caught us by surprise?
I'm not sure that the scale. I think it's what the Resilience Forum identified was the speed. I think how quickly the flooding sort of arose, the unpredictability of it, which is, there are no early warning systems. There are early warning weather systems, but of course, because it's rainfall, you can't tell where it's going to hit and when. So one of the conclusions was really, how do you get better information shared so that when people understand where these incidents are happening, they can share that really quickly so that people can then mobilise as far as possible. So this is something, again, that we've been talking to government about, how, and the Met Office, how can we improve that sort of early warning system in as much as you can do? And then what more can we do as agencies, the agencies that have responsibility for this, to help prepare for these events, things like cleaning out gullies, making sure that you're able to deploy protection systems, on critical infrastructure, mapping where that critical infrastructure really is, for example. What can you do to protect them? But recognising that these events are, much more intense rainfall so fast that the scale of water really is bigger than I think than people were expecting.
I'm going to turn to Assembly Member Bakari in a moment, but can I just ask you, in terms of the future, one thing I'm very concerned about is particularly people who are vulnerable and disabled, and getting out of buildings if they don't have access. What can we do both about those communities to make sure that we're protecting them, and also a more wider question about what can we do to avoid this scale of future flooding in the future?
So as part of the London, the flooding roundtable, we've set up a task and finish group, which is is being chaired by Mayor Glanville of Hackney, and also the chair of the Transport and Environment Committee at London Councils and the Environment Agency, Charlie Wood, and they are looking at some of those very specific issues about how those communications to vulnerable customers, identifying where they are. One of the things that we've been talking to the Environment Agency, and I know the Environment Agency have been talking to government about, is locational information on sort of, so basement properties and so on, that we can then use to try and do some more targeted communications, for example. Obviously, it's a bit difficult in London because we have a highly transient population, so you need to keep revisiting and revisiting. But what other things can we be doing in those areas as well?
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to congratulate the flooding roundtable that took place because it has improved the communication between the Environment Agency and the Thames Water. But there is still an issue with the councils and the way councils are communicating with residents, and there is still a shifting of blame of who's responsible for what and confusion for the residents. I'd like to see the Mayor do some more work with the London councils on this specific issue. And the other thing that the Environment Committee held a meeting on flooding specifically, invited council representatives, and it was we were asked about the issue of paving over front gardens, and the fact that there is impermeable material that's used for paving over gardens because people want to use their front gardens to charge their electric cars now and things like that. So there is more work to be done here, and there was a communication between us and officials from London Council, specifically Merton, and they said that there is no enforcement in place that has been taking place. There's been no successful prosecutions or anything to deter people from paving over with impermeable materials. So will the Mayor be able to push more on this?
Well, it's certainly something that we can raise with London councils and through that task and finish group to understand what more could be done. I mean, I would have to say that the local authorities, as you'll know, have been under huge pressure in terms of budget. So the planning enforcement area is a difficult one, and having to choose priorities. And often local authorities, have very different resource capabilities across London. But I'm very happy to raise that with them on your behalf.
Thank you very much. We're going to go... Oh, sorry.
Just to add to that, the Mayor has written to the Secretary of State for DEFRA to highlight the need for adequate funding for flood and highway authorities to manage flood risk. And just on depaving, he's also produced guidance on depaving and how to do that in an environmentally friendly way, recognising the risk you mentioned.
Thank you. Sorry to cut you off there for a moment. We're going to go remote now to Assembly Member Cooper, who is joining us online.
I am hopefully joining you online. Thank you very much, Assemblymember Polanski. Actually, could I just pick up on what Assemblymember Bakari was mentioning about the paving over of front gardens? It's proceeded apace since local authorities started to introduce controlled parking zones, and it's quite often associated with applications for what's called a crossover. So if they're processing a crossover, it's obvious that the planning officers, it usually is, will know, could make it as a condition of agreeing the crossover, for which they charge household applicants a considerable sum of money in many cases. Why can they not make it a condition of somebody having a crossover that they must put permeable, grasscrete or something in if they are turning it into, which they usually are if it's a crossover, a parking place? I can't hear anything.
Sorry, that I forgot. I turned off my mic. That sounds like a very sensible solution, Assemblymember Cooper. So I will again flag that with our council colleagues at London Councils to see whether there's an answer to that.
Thank you, and I think it might be something, Chair, that we might wish to make as a recommendation when we come to make recommendations from our investigation this time. I think it's something that all councils could do. It's certainly something I've raised it with officers in the councils in Merton and Wandsworth, and I'd really like to see that across London, because I totally agree with Assemblymember Bakari that paving over front gardens has been appalling. Can I just before I move on to ask about progress on the environment strategy, can I just also ask Deputy Mayor Rodrigues something about water when it's moving through, and how difficult it is then to work out how quickly it's going to arrive? Because one of the points of putting in bunds and putting in soakaways and rewilding, for example, the meanders in Ladywell Fields, for example, is to slow down the very swift passage of the water. Is that not something that is encouraged by the London Plan? And what more can we do to encourage Thames Water and the Environment Agency to step up their work on this? Because they've funded some of this work. For example, Firs Farm in Enfield was funded by them, and it has stopped the flooding of properties in Enfield. What can we do to slow down the passage of water? Is there something that this committee can do on that? I can't hear.
Right. Yeah, thanks, sorry. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think some of the funding that we've announced today are for schemes that really do look at climate resilience. You know, how do we, for example, I think there's a different scheme up in Enfield that I went to open, which actually stores water. So it's a sort of a green area that the Environment Agency were working on with the borough and with funding from the Mayor of London to protect homes from flash flooding. You know, they did some water modelling so they could understand if there was a very heavy rainfall, which homes might be flooded. And essentially that whole green area becomes a mini reservoir to hold water and hold water back, and we want to see more of those. So these are the sorts of schemes that we're helping to fund through, for example, the Rewilding London Fund, to help pilot these sorts of projects. But it's also discussions with, for example, the Regional Flooding and Coastal Committee about making funding available. We have the Sustainable Urban Drainage Plan, where we're talking about some of these things. There's been a lot of work around mapping in local authority areas, which we managed to fund a couple of pilot areas to show it can be done, but we're seeking more funding to make sure that that happens across London, so that we can really understand where are the big priorities for addressing big SUDS projects, as well as doing some of the smaller ones that would sort of pick up some of the more very smaller local, hyper-local areas as well. But definitely an excellent point that we can raise.
Thank you, thank you. If I could move on to the area of the environment strategy. We've now had the second progress report, which obviously was slightly delayed because of the COVID situation. What would you describe as being the key achievements against the strategy to date?
I touched on a couple of those in my opening remarks. I mean, obviously, the one that we've been really focusing on, I guess, more recently has been the ultra-low emission zone. And this is something that we all know the huge personal cost that has to people, the health impacts that this brings to people, from asthma to cancer to dementia to stunted lungs for children. And we know of the case, obviously, of Rosamund Adu, Kissy Deborah's daughter, Ella, you know, the first person to have air pollution as a cause of death on her death certificate now, following the inquest. These are areas that the Mayor has really taken to heart and has said we absolutely have to move much faster than we have been doing. And the work that we've been doing on, for example, the ultra-low emission zone, but also wider policies around what we can do in the London Plan to make sure that new developments contribute to improving air pollution, not just not addressing the impacts locally, but how can we make it better? So those sort of integrated approaches, the work we've been doing with Transport for London and local authorities on really getting people out of their cars and moving into more active travel, from walking and cycling to using our public transport, even, you know, despite the pandemic, will really help clean up London's hair. And I think what we've seen is the absolutely incredible response that Londoners have made, you know. In just a couple of years, the levels of compliance, both from heavy goods vehicles through to the vehicles affected by the ultra-low emission zone, is astounding. You know, much faster than would have happened if we had let things go on as people naturally move out of their vehicles or not. But making available, for example, the public transport, the cheap public transport that we have, making available more cycle lanes so that people can move into, you know, walking and cycling, doing some of the trials that we've been doing in areas, cleaning up our buses, you know, leading by example and making sure that our taxis were cleaned up. We have a new zero emission capable taxi line that is bringing jobs to Coventry, you know, creating new lines and new jobs that we need to meet our zero carbon targets. That is you know, a great testament, as I said, to Londoners and London's businesses. Some of the work that we've been doing on greening, the fact that we've been designated as the world's first national park city. And Adelaide has just been announced as the second in this series. It's the combination of policies, some of which we talked about already in terms of the Rewilding London Fund, but also this sort of urban greening factor, policies that are going to promote and preserve nature, but obviously go further, because we have to address the fact that, you know, we're one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. A report that came out around the time of COP, which is absolutely shocking. But, you know, making sure that we understand that the pandemic highlighted this, that not everybody has access to a garden or a balcony. So how do we make sure that more access, you know, we have more access? So a lot of the work that we've been doing through the funding that the Mayor has made available, we've been targeting areas where there is limited access or poor access to try and help redress those areas. And we've improved more than 400 hectares, for example, of green space through some big capital projects like Beckenham Place Park. And then obviously the fact that the Mayor declared a climate emergency, bringing forward the target from 2050 to 2030 in recognition of that, the urgency we have to act, the impacts that we're already experiencing, and then subsequently, you know, we've seen the code red warning from the IPCC. And the response to that was the Green New Deal mission, part of the London Recovery Board missions.
Okay, but
Really, sorry, go on.
No, that's obviously something that is a newer area that wasn't in the original strategy.
That's
and
true.
I think you set out for us very well the work that's been done to clean up the air, which obviously has climate impacts as well in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And you've also set out very well in terms of adding to nature in London. Are there any other areas that you would just draw out from the original strategy where work has been done that helps London to address and adapt to the impacts of climate change?
In terms of adapting to impacts of climate change, so some of the as I said, some of the funding that we've made available to local authorities and community groups to improve their green spaces, you know, which then allows for smaller SUDS projects, but, you know, allows more access to their areas. We've prepared guidance, for example, to care homes and to hospitals and others. You know, I think the first of its kind in the country, really, about how do you address the impacts of climate change in, you know, particularly for very vulnerable residents. And we know, you know, Assemblymember Plansky, the chair, mentioned about how we're dealing, you know, supporting from in terms of flooding, but overheating is a huge issue. So, and we, you know, again, we've sort of got away with it for the last couple of years, but we've seen previous incidents where many hundreds of people in this country died, and thousands across Europe died from overheating. So we have good policies in our London plan that governs new development, but in terms of existing development, how do you make those agencies and local authorities and others aware of what they might be able to do to address those areas?
So, I mean, obviously the extreme weather events that we've seen in the summer, including the flash flooding, but you're also referring to the other area, which is extreme weather events, which is the overheating, and particularly exacerbated by the urban heat island effect. What further steps has the Mayor taken to reduce these impacts of extreme weather events on London's citizens, businesses and services?
Well, again, it's a key area in London's risk register, surface water flooding. So the London Resilience Forum are looking at how various agencies can look at this. We've asked the infrastructure group, which is brings together agencies like Thames Water, UKPN and others, to start to, you know, to really address how are you mapping the climate risks on your infrastructure? What does that mean in terms of critical infrastructure for London, but what are you doing? What are you incorporating into your business planning or your plans to the regulators? In some of the conversations that we've been having with various agencies, we've been highlighting this is a big risk for us, and obviously the work that we're doing with, you know, functional bodies is identifying through that Green New Deal work, you know, what can we be doing to ensure our built environment, but the people who work and live in that built environment are as protected as far as possible.
So, I mean, obviously, you know, we're not going to be able to stop some of the changes coming through, and you're just touching on some of the adaptations and encouraging others to make those adaptations. But I think, you know, one of the questions that we always come back to when we're having these discussions, and we started that a bit with the crossovers, that's more a local authority function than a city hall function. How much power does the Mayor really have to help London adapt to extreme weather? And what additional powers would you like the Mayor to have? And how do you think those powers might help? And that could be around planning, that could be around design of homes, it could be around design of highways. Take your pick.
Like many of the things that the Mayor has responsibility for, we don't have full responsibility over everything, so it requires us to work in collaboration and in partnership with all the agencies that operate in London, including the local authorities and businesses. and that partnership is absolutely essential. But some of the powers that we've asked for include, for example, asking government to devolve more powers to enable us to map, what critical infrastructure is in London, making sure that we have adequate funding. So the funding that comes through the RFCC, the Regional Flood and Coastal Committees, we're not a flood management authority, a risk management authority, we don't participate in that. So could London and the Mayor have greater responsibility and be consulted in a more statutory way in as part of that? I don't know if there's anything else, Catherine, that particularly we want to flag.
Perhaps just to talk about heating in buildings, which is obviously one of the things that can happen during a heat wave, people overheating where they live. And that's something where the Mayor does have some powers, of course, over new developments, major new developments subject to London plan policies. But we have asked the government about devolving more powers so that we can, and the boroughs can monitor and enforce, potentially set standards as well for energy efficiency in buildings.
And just back to the risk assessments, there are a series of voluntary risk assessments that certain authorities and agencies are required to do. The government asks them periodically, but I think we really ought to be saying, that there ought to be mandatory climate risk assessments so that we can really understand what the vulnerabilities are, whether it's people or infrastructure, and that then they can be fed into the business planning or the various plans that we all have to develop.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Thank you. That's very useful. Thank you, Chair. I'll just leave it there at the moment.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come to Assemblymember Devonish in a moment, but I think Assemblymember Best has a supplementary first of all.
Hi, sorry, hopefully you can hear me. I only wanted to speak quickly, Chair, on the point that Assemblymember Cooper raised about permeable driveways, to say that many London councils already do this as a measure that you have to do as part of the application. So I think the bigger question perhaps for the Deputy Mayor is to speak with London councils to see how many do this, how many don't, and perhaps provide some guidance from herself on the Mayor as best practice to make sure all London councils are doing this. And then I did have some supplementaries. Is that okay to go on to those, Chair?
Yes, please do.
Thank you. So Shirley, thank you for coming. It was nice to meet you early in the year for our meeting on the Edmonton incinerator rebuild project. And I'm sure you're aware that that is going to be signed this week, that new contract. Could I ask, since our meeting, what have you personally done to lobby and speak to the Labour councils that are putting this forward?
As we discussed at the meeting, I think that you attended with the Mayor. The Mayor doesn't have a formal role in this. This is really down to those local authorities. So we met with representatives, the MPs that I think that you helped bring along, and some of the stakeholders. What we have done, as the Mayor has done before, is continue to reiterate his view that we don't need new incineration in London, and that where we do have incinerators in London, they have to be the best technologies and environmental technologies as possible. He's written to the Environment Agency to seek their assurance that they are looking at that and will be making sure that continues to be the case.
Because at that meeting there was a confirmation that through the Mayor and yourself you would speak with London councils to try again to put forward the case that this incinerator is far too big. Did that happen? I'd have to check back and write to you. Okay, I mean it'd have to be, if you could do it quickly, because obviously it's on Thursday it happens. The other thing I wanted to come on quickly was the ULEZ and the rollout of the expansion that you were just discussing. In a question I asked to the Mayor, he suggested that some of the funds that had supported the rollout of the ULEZ had gone to improving access to public transport. And I'm yet to get any kind of response on what money has been spent from that ULEZ fund on improving access to public transport. So perhaps you could help me with that.
From the Central London ultra low emission zone, do you mean? Or
from the expanded zone, the fund that paid for that?
Well, the expanded ultra-low emission zone only came in on the 25th of October. So we have had some charges are being paid at the moment. So I'd have to check back with Transport for London, but
Sorry,
my
can I
understanding is that it goes into the general account, and then that then gets allocated to various lines for public transport. But I'd have to check back to you to confirm that.
Okay, because the reason I ask is because obviously you'll be aware that the issue that we have in some of the outer London boroughs, where we're trying to encourage people out of cars, is they don't actually have another option but their vehicle because of the poor links to public transport. And so in an effort to actually make sure this works and encourage people out of cars as opposed to just buying new cars, that part about spending money on access to public transport is really important, but I haven't seemed to get an answer on what it was spent on. Apparently there was some money that was spent on improving access to public transport, but I haven't been able to get an answer on what that money was spent on.
We can follow up with you on that. I'll follow up on your behalf.
Okay, thank you. And just finally, I wanted to ask on the ambition to be net zero by 2030. That's something that the GLA has accepted would need the replacement of all gas boilers in London. Do you think that is an achievable target?
Well, it's a target the government has set itself. So we you know, even for its own target, we know we need to move off gas boilers onto cleaner, more renewable heating systems. Government have provided some funding, I think, for about 800,000 heat pumps, for example. But we know that there are going to be multi-millions in London alone, let alone in the country, that need to be tackled. So it's absolutely an ambition that we all share, you know, whether it's London, other local authorities or the government. It is difficult to do, and that's really what we've been working on here in London, is about how do we accelerate the take-up of those renewable and cleaner heat forms, including heat pumps.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Assembly Member Best. Just before I hand over to Assembly Member Devenish, can I just echo Assembly Member Best's concerns about the incinerator? And it's good to hear you give a clear line there that, you know, you don't support this. I went to meet local doctors, one doctor, Edward Trenar, with several other local doctors who shared yours and the Mayor's concerns about the incinerator. So just good to hear you articulate that. Assembly Member Devenish.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Deputy Mayor. Just going back to AM Cooper's questions, how many sustainable urban drainage systems has the Mayor financed since 2016, please?
I'm just checking our stats. Maybe
I can say that through the Green New Deal funding, we've provided £1.8 million of green infrastructure investment, which has gone to 40 projects to tackle surface flood risk and through SUDS.
But we can get you a fuller figure back from 2016.
Yes, please. That would be great in the detail behind it. Thank you very much. My actual question I've been asked to ask you is, are the Mayor's current plans and strategies adequate to deal with the climate change in London? And specifically, the Mayor commissioned an update to the London's net zero pathway. When is this due, please? And what will it mean for mayoral policies?
Well, the Mayor has pointed out that we don't have enough powers, for example, to tackle energy efficiency in London. We would require minimum energy efficiency standards and the ability to ask for those. So we don't have the power, he doesn't have the power to single-handedly tackle all of climate change issues in London. We've just talked about flood management, for example. We don't have a role in that. But what we can do is bring together the people that do have those powers so that we can collaborate. So as I've talked about through the Green New Deal, we're working with local authorities, the CBI, the NHS and others on what can we do to really accelerate some of the work that we've been doing on the built environment, on greening, on air pollution, on skills, for example. And we can do that whilst carrying on lobbying government for more powers, for more devolution of powers and funding. We have a very good set of policies integrated through the various strategies that the Mayor has set for London, through the environment strategy, the London plan, the transport strategy, the housing strategy. And one of the things that the Mayor had asked us all to do, the various deputy mayors, to make sure that we were working well together and to make sure that the policies and strategies that we developed really leveraged off each other, that they didn't sort of cut across each other. And I think you'll see that we have, as I've said, a really, I think, world-leading set of policies here. And what we've been trying to do with the funding that we have and the powers that we've been able to exercise is to really progress some of those policy areas. Is there more that we can be doing? We definitely are asking government for those powers. For example, as Catherine's already talked about, some of the areas that we would like to devolve to us on flooding and overheating. Yes, there's always more money and more funding and more powers that we can have, but I think we're doing well with the sets of policies that we've got.
When will the net zero pathway be updated? What date?
We hope to launch that in the new year. So we're just in the throes of just checking the final facts and figures and within it to make sure that it sort of all holds up.
And in terms of your drive, you're always talking about more money from the government, and of course we all want more money. Mm-hmm. But are you doing enough with the GLA family as it is now? Are you driving the Met and TfL and other parts of the GLA family to actually do what they can do?
Absolutely. I think you'd have to ask the GLA family whether they feel they're driven enough. But I think the Mayor has made it absolutely clear that he wants the functional bodies, the GLA family, to be leading by example and really showing what is possible, both through its own actions, but also the policies that it has responsibilities for delivering, so that we can really, when we're asking others, Londoners and London's businesses to step up, that we're able to point to some of the things that we have been doing as well. And I think the functional bodies, under very difficult circumstances, whether it's the pandemic or funding, have really stepped up, I think. So, but as we said, we all need to do much more. We're in a decade of action. We're seeing the impacts of climate change already. We're seeing the impacts of the toxic air we have. So, what more can we be doing?
I'll leave it there, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. And I sometimes wonder if it's not that we need more money, that we need more powers to make our own money. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation. Assembly Member Bokhari.
Thank you. My question is about the budget. The Mayor's draft budget says that London needs £61 billion of capital investment in buildings and infrastructure to reach out net zero by 2030. How will green finance be used to reach this goal?
That 61 billion figure was an estimate, and it's probably on the conservative side. Certainly London councils have estimated that it would probably cost in the order of 100, I think, to retrofit all of London's social housing. And obviously the bringing forward the target to 2030 will mean the numbers are likely to change, because obviously we need to be looking at how do we replace gas boilers and so on. But in terms of how do we mobilise finance, I talked about the green financing facility, which is essentially a way of raising finance from the private sector and bringing in new forms of finance, whether it's through green bonds or through different sorts of mechanisms. So one of the things that we've been working with, doing is working with the Green Finance Institute, an institution that's sitting within the City of London, experts, from that finance sector, to understand what options are available to us to set up our financing facility. And we're doing that work alongside the work the London councils have been doing with many other cities around the country on a climate commission. Their report was launched, I think, at COP earlier this year. And again, that's about bringing together projects in an investable form, something that will look attractive to the private sector. And our work is about how do we mobilise that finance to support those sort of bundles of projects. So yeah, there's a lot of work that's needed, and also sitting alongside the work of the Green Investment Bank, the government's bank, about making sure that it has a net zero mandate, and that it has a mandate to work with the regions, to support the regions, including London.
And considering the target of net zero by 2030, and also the cost, it's it's very clear now, and evidence is coming through that the cost in terms of pollution, and also the financial cost of the Silvertown Tunnel project is going to be a factor. How does the Mayor justify the project? Will he consider cancelling it for those reasons?
The Mayor is clear that we need another river crossing. The existing river crossing, the Blackwall Tunnel and also the Rotherhithe Tunnel, are not fit for purpose, really. We have huge issues around air pollution in that area from vehicles backing up, when the tunnel closes, and idling. So these are all reasons why the Silvertown Tunnel project is still going ahead. In terms of the cost of cancelling and so on, I'd have to defer to Deputy Mayor for transport, and could certainly write to you on that. But I think there have been conversations about that before, that it's not as simple as just saying that we'll cancel the Silvertown Tunnel and then the money is available.
So he won't cancel Silvertown Tunnel?
I think he said it's very clear that it's the right thing to do.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Could I ask you to write to the committee as well with the letter to Assemblymember Bakhari? Mm-hmm. Thank you. On the issue of green finance, on the Economy Committee on Friday, we had Alan Simpson from London and Partners with the Deputy Mayor for Business talk about the need for private investment in tackling the climate emergency, and of course there's a space for that. I asked him about what safeguards are there about the money that we're receiving. Particularly, we want to make sure that we're not receiving money from exploitation or conflict or wherever, and he said to me that money was neutral and it almost wasn't about where it came from, it was where it goes to. What would you say about making sure that money that we accept from private business is ethical and transparent?
I didn't see the proceedings, so I'm not quite sure, what he meant by neutral. So I'd have to ask Deputy Mayor for business on that. But we're very clear that, for example, some of the work that we'll be doing on divestment, we're very clear that there are areas that we really shouldn't be investing our pension funds into in terms of fossil fuels, for example, in terms of climate change. There are ethical policies that our pension funds run as well. And I'm sure there are due diligence checks that the GLA does as well about accepting funding. I'd have to ask for what that is but those checks I'm sure are done.
Thank you very much. And just before I come to Assemblymember Cooper again, the other thing that the Deputy Mayor was talking about was the need to bring more money into London, which I understand, particularly from tourism. Now, hopefully a lot of that will be domestic, but where it's international, would you and the Mayor consider lobbying the government for a frequent flyer levy?
What the Mayor has said is that, we do need to bring in tourists. They're a huge part of London's economy, but also we want people to be able to travel to visit family abroad and so on. What we weren't happy with was, for example, the air passenger duty changes internally, which made the sort of economic sense of using rail for short-term or for shorter journeys, uneconomical, and that seemed to go, literally fly in the face of what we were trying to achieve, the government was trying to achieve at COP26. So in terms of frequent flyer levies, there are a number of ways that we can encourage and discourage the use of sort of polluting forms of travel, whilst at the same time expecting the industry to step up and do more.
I'd love to keep pushing on this, but I won't abuse chair privilege, and I'll hand over to Assemblymember Cooper.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm hoping I'm not going to be subject to one of those working from home while self-isolating issues. My dogs are reacting to something in the street, so apologies now if that happens. I just wondered what support the Deputy Mayor thinks is required from government for the Mayor to meet climate targets, and I wondered what engagement has been going on with central government to promote the ambitions of London in an overall UK climate ambition context.
We've joined together with, for example, the UK 100 and the M10 to make the case for the devolution of powers and funding to mayors and leaders of local authorities. There is a sort of, and I'm sure Polly will talk about this shortly, with the sort of net zero bill and powers bill that would be really helpful, I think, to allow local authorities to go as fast as they can do. I think that, we all know that the powers that we have in London differ to those in Manchester and to some local authorities. And they sometimes do need to be different because we all have different circumstances. But what is in common is people in the country want us to do more on climate change and take faster action, and what we want is the ability to be able to do that. So those are things that we've raised with government, written to government in various consultation documents. The Mayor has raised this, as I've said, at the various convenings we have with other city leaders, but also internationally at COP, for example, raised it as an issue with the UN Secretary General on behalf of the mayors that he's representing through the C40. All those cities, it's not just a London issue, want the ability to go to take action as fast as they can do, and recognition of the city role in delivering on climate environmental action, whether it's the ecological emergency or the climate emergency.
And just while we're touching on the issue of the government's position and mayoral position, I just wondered, do you think that London's climate ambitions are different to the government's ambitions?
Well, the mayor has said that he declared a climate emergency because we recognise the need to go further and faster. The government have set very ambitious targets. I think there are areas where we think they could go much faster in providing us with the ability to deliver. So the strategy on the whole is broadly right. We would expect, I think what we would want is a bit more detail on what you might deliver, for example, on energy efficiency, the plans that they have set out on retrofit, for example, whilst laudable, don't translate in terms of the funding and the ability for local authorities to get on with it. For example, we talked about heat pumps, a huge gap there that needs to be addressed. Some of the work that we've been doing around supporting the supply chain, there could be more work done in those areas. So as I said, there are areas that I think more generally the direction of travel is fine, but we just need that translated into more detail. We talked about flooding earlier as well. These are all areas that if the government were to just come out with some more clearer plans, through the comprehensive spending review, provide the funding, then we can get on with it faster.
Is it clearer plans, or do you think it's more of a sense of urgency that we need from government at this point? I mean, I agree with you. I think there's some very laudable things that have come out. There's work been going on across the piece on the environment, on resource and waste management, there's a lot of statements that have come out of government, but I'm not really getting a sense of urgency with the kind of money that needs to go behind it that I think would then attract in the additional investment from the private sector at scale and at pace.
I think it's a bit of both. I think, definitely we need more plans, and we definitely need more, more detailed plans, and more urgency as well. You take the Environment Act, for example, that has just come into force. We, along with many others, have been lobbying for the PM2.5 WHO target to be on the face of the bill, and that wasn't accepted. Government are now consulting on what the PM2.5 target should be. So that's, as far as we're concerned, that's delaying what is a known issue. We know there is no safe level for PM2.5. WHO have tightened their targets. We done some work in London to show that it is possible to reduce PM2.5, and with more powers devolved, for example, to tackle non-transport sources of emissions, we could take further action to help bring more people into areas of compliance. So those are areas that are very tangible, where both detailed plans and urgency, is really to the fore. And there are lots more examples, as I've said. Actually coming up with a clearer net zero skills plan. We know to deliver the retrofit ambitions that we have, we need to get the people trained in the appropriate skills. And that goes all the way back through to, the curricula in schools, all the way through to the adult education budget, apprenticeships and so on. And, whilst we're doing what we can do, we're talking about Green Skills Academy in London, for example, that isn't enough of a systemic approach that we need across London and across the country. And that's really what we're looking for.
Thank you for that, Deputy Mayor. Now, I sort of stopped you a little bit earlier on when you started talking about the Green New Deal, when I was asking for an update on the environment strategy. But I just wondered, first of all, what the main priorities are for the last 2 years of the strategy. And obviously, the Green New Deal was launched in 2020 and has a big programme on environment policies. And I just wondered if you could tell us how the two are fitting together.
So the Green New Deal, I guess, is sort of an overarching approach to how we address the climate emergency, the toxic air pollution, but also looking at some of the inequalities that have been highlighted in the pandemic. So bringing together all those areas under that sort of one single integrated approach. But more importantly, working with all those partners that I mentioned on the recovery board from the NHS and others to really leverage off each other the action that we can take so we can do much more and much more in a coordinated way. The Mayor has been able to provide some funding to help kickstart this through the London Green New Deal Fund, and perhaps I'll bring Catherine in here just to tell you a little bit about some of those projects and where we've got to on those. But it's more about how do we turn all of our budgets and all of our plans to that focus so that we're really really targeting that area rather than just doing piecemeal projects here and there. Catherine?
Thank you. Yes, just to say we can look forward in the next 2 years to funding, particularly on future neighbourhoods, on the Solar Together London and climate resilient infrastructure funds, which already exist, but which the Green New Deal Fund will continue to support from next year.
Thank you. I just wondered, Shirley, if you could set out a little bit more. You've previously told this committee that the Green New Deal funding is seed funding, which is designed to encourage private sector funding of green projects. We talked a bit about green finance earlier on. Why do you see benefits in that approach, and what are the challenges that might need to be overcome to make it succeed?
The Mayor as a strategic authority can't fund everything, and nor can the public sector. So this has to be something that we work with the private sector on. But obviously, from the private sector's point of view, they want to make sure they make a return, that they minimise the risks to their investors. So what we're trying to do, for example, through the retrofit work, is to really bundle projects together that just aren't all the good, attractive projects, but that we get some of the ones that may be harder to fund. That's always a bit of a difficult issue, whether that's retrofit or, for example, electric vehicles. The charging points that, we've done a fantastic job in London through the policy framework that we've set, and the drive, working with government and the Office of Zero Emission Vehicles, working with the local authorities, working with Transport for London. We've really driven the take up so that we're now about a third of the country's electric vehicle charge points. And that's no accident, that's by design. But in order to increase that, we've just published an EV 2030 draft strategy, and the final one should be coming out shortly. One of the things has been the anticipated sort of input from the private sector hasn't really materialised. So what we're looking at is different ways of, for example, freeing up public land, whether it's TfL land or local authority land, to help promote the investment, greater investment. So some of the challenges that we see are really about, how do investors work with the multiplicity of agencies in, working in London, 33 local authorities, 34 if you count TfL, then you've got the GLA and various other agencies, the health sector and so on. So our job is really to try and make it easier for them to understand what the direction of travel is, what our needs are, what our wants are, and what are some of our red lines, really, given that we're in the public sector. What are our expectations on behalf of Londoners, and then making easier, facilitating their input. And that could be anything from helping them with mapping where the big sort of priority areas are, introducing people to each other, facilitating conversations like we do through some of the summits and working groups, feeding into business plans and so on. So those are some of the issues. I don't know if there's anything else particularly, Catherine, you wanted to flag.
Yes, just to say that it can be really effective for us to put in a small amount of money which then leverages private investment. So the Solar Together London example that I mentioned earlier is one where we've helped to communicate that opportunity to households. That's the sort of able to pay households who come together to seek quotes about getting solar PV installed on their homes. And because they do it together, with thanks to our encouragement, that means they get a better deal when they're purchasing that solar PV, and the cost goes down by about a third. So we're not paying for the solar PV investments on those homes. They can afford to do that themselves, but a bit of funding from us helps to get that going faster.
Thank you very much, Chair. That's well, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. I'm aware that Shirley's only got 2 more minutes left. Sakina's not spoken yet, sorry, Assemblymember Sheikh, so I'm going to give her a very brief question. If you could give a very brief answer, that'd be great, because I want to get on to COP26.
I appreciate that, Chair, and it's lovely to see you, Shirley. I know we've worked on fossil fuel divestment long before I joined the GLA, so I just wanted to integrate a conversation about some of the work that you've talked about with Sadiq, our Mayor, leading on fossil fuel divestment, which I think provides an opportunity for a lot more space to talk about what we actually want to invest in. And my specific question is, and this comes off the back of the Economy Committee that Chair spoke about, which is we are going to need private sector money in order to transition. And how do we ensure actually that public and private sector is a healthy partnership? Because we know that capital moves faster than politics. So how do we ensure that when we negotiate with private sector about investing in the green transition, that actually we get a proper bite of the pie and actually it's on our terms as much as on their terms? So just some update on fossil fuel divestment and how we are negotiating with green finance to ensure that public sector has a proper seat at the table. Thank you.
On divestment, we continue to work with the Pension Fund Authority, the London Pension Fund Authority, and obviously Transport for London's pension fund to signal the Mayor's desire, for a net zero carbon city and for them to contribute. So we are seeing steadily the reduction in fossil fuel investment. So really pleased that that's going ahead. We're working with local authorities, whether it's in London or outside of London, to promote that area. And in terms of setting the agenda, it's absolutely clear. Saying we want a city that is net zero carbon, one that is socially equal, so recognising the social justice issues, and as I've said before, really setting out those red lines, for the Mayor that we expect a sort of an ethical approach as well as an environmental approach to the investment that we see in London.
Thank you very much. And a final question from Assemblymember Bokhari.
Yeah, I'm going to try and make this brief. So the Mayor recently attended COP26. Has this had any impact on priorities, targets set in the London Environment Strategy? And there are 3 areas I'd like if we can focus on. The commitment set out in the strategy, do you think they're sufficient to meet the scale of the challenges we face? What actions will be taken forward? And then the councils in London, and how are you going to be operating with them to tackle the climate emergency? Oh, and one final point, as chair of C40, how is he going to work with other cities in a collective global effort to protect the environment? Good luck with answering that.
The Mayor has made it really clear that it's a privilege to be the chair of an amazing organisation focused on climate, tackling climate change for a long time. But over the years, it's taken in many of the priorities that we already are taking on in London. For example, the Global Green New Deal. Air pollution is a big area that that he co-chairs a network with. Divestment, he co-chairs a network with New York on that. So these are all areas that we have been working on in London and then been trying to push through the C40. So he wants to see more of that. But his more immediate priorities, I think, having listened to fellow mayors on the steering committee and to others that he talked to when he was seeking election, was that the inequalities that cities around the world are facing in terms of global south cities being the ones that are being most impacted and most severely impacted by climate change, but funding doesn't necessarily recognise that. So he wants to make sure that the C40 budget really focuses on that. But he wants to bring the experience that he has in London. So, for example, the Breathe London network that we have, we know how much that has made a difference in making the case for demonstrating why it's important to take action on air pollution. So he's asked C40 and he's going to be working with them to roll this out globally to a Breathe Global network, so a network of air quality monitors around cities, so that they can start to work on improving that air pollution problem, which the solutions to that are often ones that will help improve climate change as well, which goes back to the sort of core work of what they're doing at C40. In terms of what we're doing with boroughs, we had a very successful summit working with local authorities about that huge, number of them have declared climate emergencies, are taking actions. They have a series of work streams which overlap with the work streams that we have through the Green New Deal mission. So the Retrofit Summit, for example, is an example of where we're working together to tackle both fuel poverty but also carbon emissions. So working very closely together on areas, for example, on tackling plastic waste. How can we reduce that? We've done a lot of work in London on rolling out water fountains and refill fountains, but what more can we do? We've got new policies coming in from the government, so we've been working with local authorities and London to make sure that the next set of the recycling plans really address these issues as well, and also going further to promote the circular economy and really take action on reducing waste. Those are the two questions I could remember that you asked, I'm afraid, so I can't remember the other two.
I also mentioned London councils because you met with them, and then being chair of C40.
Yeah, so London Council, so the summit was a product of the work that the officers meet regularly. I meet regularly with Mayor Glanville and others, Georgia Gould and others, attend tech committee or executive where necessary. So have very good, strong relationships, and really that's, the strongest, I think, that we've seen for many years, and partly it's sort of an output, I guess, of the work that we're doing on recovering from the pandemic. And as chair of C40, I've talked a little bit about the mayor's priorities. Do we is that impacting on what we're doing? Of course, because any best examples of good practice that we see that other cities are doing, the mayor will say to me, well, why aren't we doing that? So, and vice versa. The whole point of these networks is really to look at our peers and understand what can be done. It's not always possible to replicate what others do because we don't have the powers, the necessary powers, for example, tax raising powers or whatever that, for supporting transport for London, for example, if you compare what Tokyo and New York are able to do. But there are workarounds that we try to do, and we share those as well.
Thank you very much. And on that, thank you both very much for your time. We're 5 minutes over, so please do extend my apologies to your next meeting. But thank you very much, Shirley Rodrigues and Catherine Barber, for coming to committee. We now are going to do a quick transfer to our second panel of guests to this meeting. I feel like for those people watching live, I should keep talking like live TV, but I won't. It's just going to go quiet for a few moments. Thank you very much. And just as they're settling into their places, I'll just introduce our second panel of guests to this meeting. We have returning to our panel, Lilli Matson, who came to our Environment Committee at the last meeting, I believe, who is Chief Safety, Health and Environment Officer for TfL. We have Dr. David Joffe, from the Head of Carbon Budgets from the Climate Change Committee, and Polly Billington, who is Chief Executive of the UK 100. In the first section, we're mainly going to be aiming our questions at David and Polly. Just to say specifically to you, Lilli, because we do have transport coming up. If you do want to come in at any point and it's not given, please do indicate and I'll do my best to bring you in. David, if I can begin with you. Last month, I went to COP26 for the 2 weeks on behalf of the Environment Committee. Saw lots of interesting things and heard lots of interesting things. But from your point of view, how was COP26 and what were the main achievements? There we go. You're on now.
I'm on. Okay, great. That's a nice, easy question to start with. So I guess how you view COP26 depends on your expectations going in. We were never going to get the increases in ambition that we need across the globe at the COP itself. I think we've now got a process, hopefully, to increase ambition across a range of countries. Several countries increased their ambition during 2021, and that was very helpful. But we were never going to get some of those other countries signing up to more ambitious targets. So I think progress has been made in a range of areas. Was it enough progress? Probably not. But it's also more than many people expected. So you can be glass half full or glass half empty on that, I think.
And you inferred there's places where we haven't made progress. So what would you say were the key challenges or disappointments, I suppose, from the conference?
I think, completing the rule book was important, and we've made progress on that. Finance was always going to be a challenge, and it remains a challenge. The deal with South Africa was a really interesting new approach to trying to make progress. So, it's a mixed picture. I wouldn't say I'm an expert on COP26 and the expectations, but I would point you to the summary and assessment that the CCC published, I think, last week of that conference.
A really excellent report. Something I'm really keen to kind of express, particularly in the media, is that this was actually the beginning of COP26 for the UK in terms of the presidency began with the event and finishes up until the beginning of Egypt. What would you say the UK government need to be doing, or the UK in general, in the next 12 months to further our ambitions?
Another big question. The UK as a leader, I think, has to go from setting targets, which it's already done, to setting out plans, which is largely done but not completely, to now delivering. And I think the biggest leadership role that we can play as a country, as president of the COP process, is to actually start to really implement the plans that we've got now as the UK. And to, many countries across the world have ambitious targets, but they mean nothing if you don't actually deliver on those. And so that's the example that we need to set as COP president during 2022.
Thank you. And my final question, and then I'll open to my fellow Assembly members, is what does this mean for London? So we've got these ambitious targets. How do we do this in the next 12 months?
I guess that's a similar answer. London really needs to show that it's serious about meeting its extremely ambitious goal for net zero. And, that's challenging in a sense because not all of the powers accrue to the mayor. But, London really needs to deliver on that. And the first stage of that we heard from Shirley, we'll see in the new year in terms of the revised plan and how that net zero is going to be delivered. I think, now that the mayor is also chair of the C40, I think there's a huge leadership role potentially there as well. So, as I said, for the UK, so for the mayor as well.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Devenish.
Thank you, Chair. To Dr. David Joffe and Polly, and Polly Billington, what does the outcome of COP26 mean for London and other UK cities, please? Specifically, what is the role of the cities and local government in climate risk mitigation and adaptation? And please, can you be specific with examples that perhaps will bring these points to life?
Okay, I think, thanks very much for the question. It's a very important one. Key to cities and London in particular is the fact that we have an acknowledgement in the UN text of the importance of cities and local government in the final text. It wasn't there for all of the 2 weeks, and it was a testament to the determination of a number of local leaders from across the globe. They managed to ensure that local government was finally recognised in the text. I would urge everybody to take from this a learning that there needs to be eternal vigilance when it comes to UN negotiations on the importance of local leadership. It will drop out when the negotiators are focusing on things like nationally determined contributions. But nationally determined contributions will be delivered by local government. And that is a really important learning. It's a really important outcome from COP. Now, and it goes to David's answer on the issue of 2022 being the year of delivery, we now actually need to be able to see that being delivered, and that will require not just the warm words, which are extremely welcome in the net zero strategy from the government about the importance of local action on net zero, but now investment and a plan which has milestones and deadlines and resources allocated to it so that those things can happen. Because as David says, we've got targets which are great. They are really ambitious. Well, let's not underestimate how ambitious they are. Our members actually, and we're very pleased to welcome the GLA now as one of our newest members, have actually made a commitment to be more ambitious than national government in terms of targets, bringing dates forward, being net zero carbon on their own assets by 2030 and across their whole communities by 2045, ahead of the 2050 target nationally. Why? Because we know there will always be laggards. So if we're going to hit 2050, then we need to make sure the most ambitious are up there ahead of the game. And also, most importantly, because once they've made that commitment, it gives them a reason to go back to national government and say, we need to be able to look at what we are doing. And this gives us an evidence base in order to be able to do more. So we think that COP is important in that it is enshrined the importance of local government in the delivery of those nationally determined contributions and hitting the science. We think next, however, it's key that that is translated into changes in laws and regulations in this country that enable more of that local action. Sometimes that will be about delegating powers downwards, which I know there's already been some conversations about, and I'm very happy to talk about the specifics of that. But quite often this is about national regulations and legislation getting in the way. So, for example, the way that you get permissions to be able to extend the grid or build a new district heating system. Ofgem obliges nothing to be built ahead of need, which actually means that the Olympic Park in London had to ask for a special derogation to be able to build a district heating system that was big enough for future homes. And we think that those kind of derogations shouldn't have to be exceptions that take a really long time to get through. There should be a presumption of building that kind of thing locally, because we know that heat and transport, which are the two most difficult things to decarbonise, happen in places. So that's a really good example of how a national rule needs to change. National planning policy framework is another one. And so we're suggesting, having done the analysis of where the powers lie and the limits of them, that there should be a net zero local powers bill, which would wrap up where those national regulations and legislations are limiting that local power and changing those rules so that what you have is a presumption of enabling, empowering and ultimately obliging local government to be able to do this. Because without that, and obviously the resources would need to go with it, without that you will not be able to get the decarbonisation, particularly of homes, heat, buildings and transport that's required. I can give some examples, Assemblymember Devenish, on the specifics of things that people are already doing, and some of those are actually in London boroughs. Quite often what we find is that London examples are sometimes unhelpful in the rest of the country because they don't have the powers that London has. So although it's understandable for the GLA to be saying we want more powers, the rest of the country will say, well, we'd really love to just start with that, frankly. But what's interesting is that people's initiative and innovation are already demonstrating what can be done. You'll know, for example, of the innovation that's happening in Enfield Council with their district heating network, which is tackling both fuel poverty and providing practically net zero heat. Camden Council has got a district energy network between Euston and King's Cross. Westminster's low carbon roadworks scheme, delivering roadworks in a low carbon way. Greater Manchester's growth hub, and I think it's important to learn from particularly other big cities where perhaps they don't have the powers that you have, but are still demonstrating leadership. Their growth hub has managed to support local companies and organisations, as well as metropolitan boroughs. And I think there are other things that are worthwhile thinking about, which might seem quite small, but can demonstrate big change. We've got a number of local authorities outside of London that have put conditions on building parking spaces when they build more homes, and instead making sure that they're supporting car clubs. Now, if places like Norwich Norwich City Council can do that. I think London boroughs can do that too. We know that some London boroughs are doing that, but we need to think about what happens at the best level that's suitable. So I've got a range of examples of what can happen. I think that what's also important is making sure that when you've got strategic powers, you use them in the best way possible. What's interesting is that now Peterborough and Cambridgeshire Metropolitan Mayor is now using carbon pricing to make decisions. Cornwall Council, which is actually a unitary authority, has got a decision-making wheel that manages to prioritise carbon decisions and put them alongside the co-benefits that are always really crucial, and you've talked about in terms of social equity and economic growth. So using the strategic powers to demonstrate what's possible enables you to have the greater opportunity and greater authority to go to national government to see that those rules should change.
That's very helpful, and perhaps you can write with a full list rather than read them all out now.
Absolutely, I've got a full briefing for you.
I'll read my next question and I'll let David come in, because actually the questions do sort of follow one another on. What are the current gaps for London and other cities to adapt and mitigate their climate risk, David?
I'll have a go. I think the national government has set out now its net zero strategy. I think there still are some gaps in there. I think particularly on the building side, which buildings is going to be the most difficult part of the transition from my perspective. I think it's going to be expensive, and it's also difficult. Even apart from the cost, I think there are difficulties there. People's homes are clearly an emotional thing for them. We have a gap in the national policy framework in terms of energy efficiency improvements to owner-occupied homes, which is a large proportion of the building stock. We have some policies on private rented, etc., but that owner-occupied segment is lacking policy, and I don't think recent history suggests that we will get much energy efficiency improvement just through people deciding that this is the week or this is the year that they're going to do that. I hope I'm wrong there, but we could do with some policy there, and it would be great if the mayor had more powers there on energy efficiency for homeowners. There's going to be a big challenge then on the rate of zero carbon heating systems that can be installed. The net zero by 2030 target, I don't think, there was a question earlier, are we going to have managed to have got rid of all our gas boilers in London by 2030? I don't think that's possible, personally. I think we can have a good go, but I don't think that's possible. But in a sense, there are three parts to that process. One is making sure that every new home has a zero carbon heating system, whether that's a heat pump, whether that's being connected to a heat network, or whatever it is. The second is that when people are replacing their heating system, that every new replacement heating system is zero carbon. And the third one is, well, what do we do about the boilers that haven't even come to the end of their life yet? And boilers that were installed this year, most of them will not have reached the end of their life by 2030. So what are we talking about there? Are we talking about ripping out gas boilers that are already working? So I think that's a big challenge. And I think for new build, we have a policy framework there. Government has committed to zero carbon new build by the middle of this decade, and I know that London is trying to go further. But even doing the second of those, making sure that every replacement heating system is zero carbon, will take the best part of a decade, because we just don't have the supply chains at the moment. We saw the example of the Green Homes Grant, where the government allocated a lot of money, £3 billion, to upgrade of homes and buildings. The money just couldn't be spent because the supply chains do not exist to deliver those measures. So we need to gradually expand supply chains for energy efficiency and for zero carbon heating through this decade. And realistically, it will be at very best the second half of the decade by the time every new heating system in London can be zero carbon. And even then, we will have that backlog of existing gas boilers that won't come to the point of being replaced by 2030. So I think that's a huge challenge. And I think we need to be realistic about how much can be achieved while being as ambitious as possible. I think we also need to be realistic on that.
Thank you. I have a final question, but it's partly the same as the earlier ones. how can cities do more to decarbonise? But can I be a bit more specific and ask, if there's one thing you want the mayor to do, what would it be? Please.
Yeah, I think one of the things is to work as closely as possible with London councils on the energy efficiency issue, because I'd just like to pick up on some of the things that David has said. We've got a £9 billion manifesto commitment from this government into energy efficiency. I think if all we were going to do was to spend that money, you won't get, if you just spent £9 billion, I think Shirley pointed out that wouldn't touch the sides really in terms of London energy efficiency efforts. So you've got to crowd in more money. So be as innovative as possible on building business models which integrate things that will generate income, i.e. energy generation, in order to be able to cross-subsidise your retrofit. Work with government to work out how they will spend that £9 billion better. Remember, the Green Homes grant was most effectively spent by local authorities and not by individuals, going to David's point. And working as closely as possible with local authorities so that they integrate energy efficiency improvements into things like their local plans and their development plans. We've already got examples. I was just looking at my notes here of Stockport and the City of York have both included in their local plans criteria for improving energy efficiency in existing homes. Now that, then they don't have any special powers. They've chosen to do that. So I think there's something where, bearing in mind, the Mayor of London has more powers than most other places have. The strongest power he's really got is his convening power and demonstrating of leadership. It's fantastic that not only is he chair of C40, but is now also a member via the GLA of UK 100, because that means he and you can collaborate with other local authorities across the country who are doing these things with fewer powers, but demonstrating what's possible. I think that, again, gives more authority to be able to go to national government and say, don't chuck away that £9 billion. Spend it really wisely by changing the rules. One would be really straightforward. Save the money on the 20% VAT that is on all retrofit. That would save the public sector an enormous amount of money when they are doing retrofit on social housing, and indeed would save lots of those people who will be worried about what they do with their retrofit when they're refurbing their own homes. Be clear that this is about shaping and creating markets, not just about chucking money at the problem. And I think those, if the mayor adopts a few of those sort of strategic things and learns from people who are already doing this without the kind of powers that the London mayor has, we could get much further in London. And that's important, going to David's point, is that if we're going to get all of this done by 2030, we need to have started yesterday.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. Chair.
Thank you very much. And can I just echo those sentiments? When I was in COP, on behalf of the Environment Committee, I went to meet in Glasgow the Environment Committee there, and in Holyrood the Net Zero Committee. And I think that collaborative work that the C40 and UK 100 has been doing is really important. Assembly Member Sheikh.
Thank you, Chair. And I think a lot of what I was hoping to sort of ask you really has already been brought out in some of your answers. So I think it would just be about teasing it out again and bringing it together. Polly, I found specifically a lot of what you said fascinating, and I would support Assemblymember Devonish's request that you send as much of that information in writing as possible after the committee. I guess my main question at the moment for you was, do you think the Mayor's climate action ambitions go far enough? And I think what I might do is actually just sort of drill down on that. So you've talked to a couple of things that I thought were really interesting. For instance, the innovative business models, about cross-subsidising local energy initiatives, something that I think some councils or some campaign groups with councils have been calling for a long time is local energy companies. We saw the Robin Hood energy company in Nottingham, but we've seen some kind of problems with that in terms of actually creating revenue. We've also, and obviously we have London Power from the Mayor, but I think there's, not to get too technical, some complications around whether it's white labelling or whether you actually have your ability to generate your own energy and actually what that means in terms of revenue. So do you think the Mayor's climate action ambitions go far enough in some of what you've talked about in terms of convening as well? So in terms of highlighting best practice and in terms of, as you sort of said, the innovative business models specifically, do you think that the Mayor is doing enough on highlighting those?
Well, forgive me, one of the things that's really difficult in this area, right, is that we are dealing with science which doesn't negotiate, and everybody in this room pretty much either is elected or works with people who are elected, and the first thing an elected politician does is start to negotiate. And science is coming barreling towards us, but we still go, okay, well, what about 2.5? And science goes, well, it'll mean extreme floods and extreme heating conditions and all these kind of things and mass migration. And you kind of go, whoa, what do we do? So that is fundamentally the problem. So when people say, oh, is it not ambitious enough? The buck stops with the science, right? That's the thing that we're not negotiating with. And we have to, therefore, find ways to be able to meet that as fast as possible, which is why I kind of say you've basically got this laws of science barreling towards us, and you've got the rules of politics. And the rules of politics need to be worked on to be able to meet that. So that means, that's why I keep going on about changing the rules, because those are the only rules that can change. And that's why using all the rules, all the powers you've got within the rules is important. Your ambition needs to be maximalised. Your convening power needs to be maximalised, because as a national figure and an international figure, the Mayor of London has an important role to play in demonstrating what's possible, but also not only just demonstrating what's possible with what he's got, but also supporting other people to be able to do more. On the specifics of energy companies, we've seen a number of different ways that those have fallen out. And I think what's useful to identify is that quite often people have gone with a local energy company on the basis of doing supply. And what they found actually is supplying power and electricity and energy to people and dealing with consumers is really difficult. It's not quite the same as collecting council tax. And particularly working in a very, very complicated energy market is also really difficult. What I think is much more interesting and has much more opportunity is the generating of electricity and power. And I would cite my own council. I mean, I need to declare an interest here. I'm a councillor in Hackney who is establishing Hackney Light and Power, where if initially exploring the supply option, the sort of white label option, they eventually decided to go with effectively an energy service company model where they're generating electricity and power, that is their ambition, and to create a green home scheme across the borough, which will not only do that retrofit for existing social homes, but potentially the ambition is to create the supply chain and the workforce that will mean that the owner-occupiers feel confident about being able to get people who will know what they're doing into their homes. So I think that this, again, it depends on what the rules allow. There wasn't a possibility of supplying local energy supply companies until the rules were changed before 2010. Then people tried it, and some of them have worked and some of them have worked less well. So it is absolutely about the regulation, and this can be quite complicated, and because of all of the requirements that an energy market regulation needs to meet. But if we're going to decarbonise in a fair way and do that in the most efficient and fair way, which is probably local, then we need to establish a set of rules that enables that to happen. At the moment, we're still basically working with an energy system which is pumping electricity and power out from Drax and from Didcot, etc. And yet Cornwall generates more energy than it uses, and it can't pump it back to the rest of the country because the interconnector is not strong enough. It doesn't go both ways. So that's the kind of technical change that we require, but the technical change won't happen unless a regulatory change happens. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for not only the GLA, but also London boroughs to do more collaboratively, and also learn and understand, because London doesn't work in a vacuum, where and how it can be lobbying for change in those regulatory frameworks that would enable more to happen locally.
No, that's fascinating, because it's sort of almost building on some of the conversations we actually had in the Economy Committee on Friday. This is what the panel at that point said as well, in terms of, the question that I put to Shirley and to the panel on Friday was, this infrastructure that you talk about, more often than not, actually the private sector has moved much quicker than politics has. If you look at offshore wind in the UK, our capacity to generate electricity...
That didn't happen by magic, though, Sakina. That happened because of regulatory change and investment by national governments of 3 different stripes over a period of 15 years. So I think we need to remember that offshore wind and its technology is only giving us the cheapest electricity that we could imagine because of the decisions of politicians over a long period. And that kind of commitment to other technologies, particularly local, decentralised, decarbonised technology, is essential if we're going to be able to get to where we want to get to.
Thank you, Polly. No, that's quite all right. And I'm pleased to hear you're flying the flag of politics. But I'll probably echo back your same point to me earlier, which is the buck stops with science. And actually, we're not moving quick enough, far enough. And actually, although you might have talked about 15 years of public investment in offshore wind, if you look at the stats of offshore wind in the UK, it's owned broadly by either EU states or private companies. So the point that I was going on to hopefully make was I don't think we are doing enough, actually. And actually our capacity is huge. And in order for us to actually meet the demands of making sure this sort of buck stops with science, the private and public sector partnership is going to be crucial. But one thing I'm not convinced about, and I'm yet to hear a kind of sort of reassuring answer, is in a private and public sector relationship, how do you ensure that the public is actually getting a proper seat at the table? Because like I said, if you do look at the ownership of offshore wind in the UK, I think the UK government owns less than 5%, whereas over 50% is owned foreign by businesses or foreign states. So my concern is actually we're not moving quick enough, and 1.5 to stay alive was what we heard from COP in 2015 in Paris. So yes, absolutely, we need to move much, much quicker to ensure global south countries, small state islands aren't going to be sacrificed in the climate crisis. And for me, that when we interweave it back into the UK, that means ensuring that the public sector can catch up. So my specific question is, how do we ensure that that relationship is mutually beneficial?
Okay, there's two aspects to that. One is we've already got a situation where a number of our members are pointing out that they can see offshore winds from their cities, and yet they don't own them. And not only that, but the people who built them, the jobs that were generated were basically the people who ran the hotels for the engineers from Denmark to come and live there. And so we need to have a much more integrated approach to making sure that we are creating the skills, we're skilling our own workforce up to be able to do that. But also the ownership thing, again, is about models and being able to raise money and so forth. Don't underestimate, it might not be that offshore wind is something that is owned by the public sector in this country, but increasingly our members are being extremely innovative on solar farms. I can cite the example of Warrington, but many others who have built solar farms, partly with public money, but also being able to leverage in private money to be able to effectively offset the equivalent of their electricity bill themselves in their councils. So that's important. That's already happening within the existing framework. Some of those have become less ambitious as the income generated by solar has become slightly less preferential because of the loss of feed-in tariffs. But as that market matures, that's not necessarily going to be a problem forever. But most importantly, and this goes to something that Assemblymember Devenish asked about, one thing the Mayor could do is fight for local authorities to have a really good development capital from the UK Infrastructure Bank. They said that they're supposed to have a net zero objective. I'd like that defined into a mandate, so clear that we would be sure that it wouldn't invest in, I don't know, for example, a coal mine in Cumbria. I haven't had a categorical refusal of that. But most importantly, they've allocated about £4 billion to local authorities out of that money. It's not clear that it's development capital. And you guys will know better than I do, the nature of money really matters and where it goes into the pipeline. Local authorities have a lot of ambition. They do need competence and capacity, and the bank is there supposed to help and support them to be able to develop their projects a bit further, but there will need to be patient development capital in order to be able to crowd in private investment capital later on. And if you're talking about making sure that you get the best bang for your taxpayer buck, that is probably where the money needs to be spent. And that means that your investment capital later on in the pipeline will be more confident, your pension funds will go in, they will be, they're the ones who want to invest in things like offshore wind because it's 10, 20, 30 years of revenue stream, but they don't want to be doing the risky bit. So what is taxpayers' money for if it's not for de-risking something which already unfortunately, our economic system creates the external environmental risk. So that's where I think that money should be. So as much advocacy as possible on the nature and structure of that money from the infrastructure bank, specifically for net zero projects and local government, would make a real difference. And I would commend the GLA and the Mayor for taking the initiative on the finance facility specifically for London. We have 1% of the emissions in the world from this country, which is already double, bearing in mind there's 196 countries, so that's even now we're double what our fair share if it was evens. But secondly, 15% of the world's global emissions are invested in the City of London. 15%. If we can't show some moral authority by changing how that money is invested properly into decarbonising our economy globally, then we're not really showing proper leadership.
I couldn't agree more, and I think, the fossil fuel divestment has been part of spearheading that kind of cultural change locally, so it's good to hear you flying that flag as well. David, can I bring you in on some of these questions? So A, what do you think about the Mayor's climate ambitions? Do they go far enough? And B, what do you think the government is doing enough to support cities like London to achieve their climate action?
Thank you. In terms of climate ambitions, I mean, I guess it depends whether you mean the high-level ambition to reduce emissions, the net zero by 2030 target, or whether you mean the ambitions for actually what's going to be delivered in order to meet that.
I see them as part of the same thing, so maybe responding to both of them.
Okay, so I mean, net zero by 2030, I don't think is achievable in its own essence. I don't think we can get rid of every gas boiler, every fossil fuel car, every incinerator, et cetera, by 2030. I just think physically and within the system that we have and the time that we have, you can't get to absolute zero. Now, net zero means that you can offset some of those remaining emissions by paying for reductions elsewhere. But really, what London should be focusing on is reducing emissions in London and not that little net bit at the end. And whether that's, whether London gets to 70% or 80% emissions reduction by 2030 and then pays for the rest, or manages to get beyond 80, those are different flavours of net zero. So I think it's an extremely ambitious target that I don't think we can physically meet within London, but there are ways of making the numbers add up. The question then is, what's the plan to meet the 2030 ambition? And I mean, I think we heard earlier that we'll see that in the new year, so I can't speak to that precisely, but I think some of the big questions there are, for a car or a boiler that someone's bought this year, what are we going to do about that by 2030? Those things last for 15 years. So if it was bought this year, it's still going to be there in 2030 unless we do something about it. So what's the plan? Are we going to scrap the cars? Or are we going to force people to sell them and buy an electric car instead? And where do those cars go that are sold? Do they go to the rest of the country and so on? Are we going to rip out the gas boilers, etc.? So I think we really need to see clarity on what does net zero really mean for London. And yes, go as far as we can, go as fast as we can on the emissions reduction, but what happens with those things that we can't get rid of by 2030?
Thank you very much. I mean, look, it's my job as a politician to talk about political will and political ambition, and I think that actually setting political ambition is the first step to achieving something. And I think that practicalities can always be met by finance. And actually, if this is our singular political priority, then we need to put our money where our mouth is, and that means stop sort of subsidising fossil fuel companies and invest heavily in scrappages schemes if that's what's required, or invest heavily in creating the local infrastructure and the supply chain to ensure that we do have that transition. So I think 2030 needs to remain our target, and I would hope anyone in any position of leadership speaking on climate change would seek to push that political aspiration, given the kind of crisis mode that we've talked about, and that was spoken about a lot at COP, but also in 2015 when we set the 1.5 target. Okay, I think I'll finish there, but before I do that, Polly, could you just tell me a little bit about UK 100 and the role it's playing in helping London achieve its net zero ambitions?
Yes, certainly. I've just been...
I think your mic isn't on.
Sorry, yes, certainly. I'm just looking. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. 14 London boroughs are now members of UK 100, as well as the GLA. There's 93 of our members have signed that net zero pledge, which is the 2030 on their own assets, and 2045 across the whole communities. The point really of having a network like this is to complement the kind of work that C40 does. So we do knowledge share within the nation, right? So everybody's working pretty much with the same national regulation, even if they're working with different powers, and working out therefore what they can do more of because other people are already doing it. So we therefore have been able to share with people things like the Nottingham workplace parking levy, district heating networks that have been established, the solar farms that I've been talking about. Solar Together as a London initiative has now been adopted by about half a dozen of our members elsewhere in the country, including other metropolitan combined authorities. So it's an example of things that can be done at scale that is really useful. But also the insights from what works helps us to understand what doesn't and the limits of those powers. So our piece of work, Power Shift, which again I can share with the committee, is a comprehensive analysis of the powers that local authorities currently have got and where and how they can use them, but also the limits of those powers. Minimum energy efficiency standards was described by one of our members as not worth the paper it's written on. Because fundamentally all that local authorities have got is enforcement powers by the tenants raising the issue. Now we all know, I'm sure you guys will all know the concerns about any tenant raising with a landlord, concerns about the quality and standard of their homes. And so there needs to be changes on that. Changes on EPC, certification, which ultimately only drives a particular kind of measure and doesn't actually drive decarbonisation of your home. And if there's one thing that would help with David's point about when people are ready to do that decarbonisation, it would be when they need an EPC certificate when they're selling their home. So just a few examples of how we make the difference. Advocating to national government off the basis of what isn't working is the key thing that differentiates us from C40 because we're working within a national framework. And we launched at COP a piece of research which looked at other in-country local leadership networks across the globe, one on almost every continent, to understand what it is about these kind of networks that really help accelerate the shift to net zero. There's lots of reasons, you know, that local leaders are well placed to do environmental action better than national leaders, not only their powers but their connections to their communities. And we've seen that from, you know, Argentina through to Japan, that those kind of local in-country networks really provide a very valuable resource in being able to accelerate that shift.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I just want to endorse so much of what I just heard, particularly around politics can't negotiate with science and won't. And just, I guess, to give credit to Alok Sharma as well, who did actually say that we can't get to net zero by 2030 and start in 2029. It needs to happen right now. So it's good when there's agreement on these things. Maybe not always agreement on how to get there, but agreement on the scale of the emergency. Assembly Member Bakhari.
Thank you, Chair. So this is a question specifically for Polly and your role as the Director of UK 100. A coalition of 18 NGOs called the More Natural Capital, who share a common vision for a greener London, performed an audit and produced a report on the Mayor's progress on his manifesto commitments 100 days after the election. I welcome the fact that the Mayor has signed up to the UK 100's aims this year. How are you using your role as Director of UK 100 to encourage the Mayor to work and engage with others with a range of climate action groups across London, for example, like More Natural Capital?
One of the key things we do is emphasise to all of our members the leadership role that they've got in collaborating with existing stakeholders within their communities, and for them to understand where they can learn from people who've got extra expertise that they don't have as elected politicians. Most elected politicians are lay people in this regard, and therefore what they need to be able to be doing is bringing that expertise into their local authorities and their decision-making processes. So we always emphasise, just because you can't do it and you don't have a specific power, doesn't mean it can't be done and that you won't have a role in facilitating that to happen. So things like the Natural Capital Coalition and others that particularly work on the sort of two aspects of that. One is the finance aspect of financing nature-based solutions, and the other is the specifics on biodiversity, is that you need to be bringing people into the conversation who know and understand those specifics, but work with them to understand how to mainstream these messages so that those people who don't spend all their time thinking about biodiversity, who don't spend all their time worrying about the climate, and frankly who don't have any money, are comfortable with the direction of travel. And we know that one of the biggest humps to this is that there is an extraordinary amount of expertise in a small number of people who spend our time, living and breathing this, all of the, and then about 80% of the population who have other things to worry about, and then about 5 to 10% of the people who are militantly against it. Well, I haven't got time to worry about the people who are 5 to 10% militantly against it. I think the 80% of people who've got other things to worry about, I should be making sure they feel comfortable with the direction of travel. And that's something I think is really important for political leaders, elected leaders, to work with those experts to be able to produce solutions that have that kind of public
and on that
support.
point of political leaders, you yourself are a politician, and you've talked about the fact that science doesn't negotiate. And as a politician yourself, I'm sure that you'll agree that the evidence and the amount of number of groups like More Natural Capital who have been saying that we need to do a lot more, that we need to push the mayor to do a lot more. Specifically, and I've asked the Deputy Mayor today about this, on the Silvertown Tunnel. What's your position on this, and will you be pushing the mayor to make sure that he stops the Silvertown Tunnel going ahead?
I'm not clear on where the process is on the Silvertown Tunnel, but I am clear on the fact that the Silvertown Tunnel decision-making ends up being something where it ends up looking like it's the right answer because of the way that national rules apply. And this is one of the things that is really problematic. The Department for Transport basically measures economic growth by vehicle movements. So the more cars that move around, the more economic growth is deemed to be happening. Well, if that is a fundamental, straightforward justification for more roads to be built, and that's how they defend a £79 billion road generation scheme, and that could well be one of the underpinning.
Are you supporting the Silvertown Tunnel?
No, I'm not supporting.
No,
the
you're
Silvertown
not.
Tunnel.
So, are you going to be pushing the mayor to do?
What I am saying is these decisions, which local authorities and local leaders end up having to make within the rules, end up being sometimes the only thing that's their option. I know a number of our members, particularly in the east of London, are deeply uncomfortable about the Silvertown Tunnel. What I look at is, because people have to make the decisions that they have to make, what I have to look at is what are the rules that are driving those decisions, and how do we change those? And if you have a situation where the economic stacks up for something that is environmentally deleterious, then we need to be changing those rules.
Thank you very much. It's good to hear you be so clear on the Silvertown Tunnel there. Could I go to Assembly Member Best?
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, guys. Hopefully you can hear me. And I just wanted to point out, Chair, it does seem to me a bit of a shame that we don't have the Deputy Mayor with us for this section, because there's a lot coming out. I think, it'd been really helpful if we could have spoke with the Deputy Mayor or the representative from the GLA. But I think, so my question is going to be around the relationship between local authorities and central government in light of the report from the National Audit Office, which said a lot had to be done in that relationship. And I think it's been covered quite extensively, but if anyone had any more to add, just on perhaps improving the dialogue between local and central government, and how we kind of start that conversation and make sure that climate action is funded and prioritised across the whole country. That was to all, so if anyone had anything to add, because I know it has been spoken about quite extensively.
Should we jump to Polly first while your mic's on?
I was just going to say, one of the good things that came out of the net zero strategy was an agreement to establish a net zero local forum. And we'd prefer it to be a delivery board than a forum. I don't want it to be a talking shop, but I have agreed that it will be cross-departmental, will involve local authorities, and will explore the options of a framework, which is some of the research that, some of the result of our work on power shifters, that we recognise that there needs to be some kind of framework in order for local climate action to happen. But I can't emphasise enough the scepticism in Whitehall. I'm sure you guys are fully aware of it. The scepticism in Whitehall about the effectiveness of local government to be able to deliver generally. So making the case for the economic benefit of this locally, and the fact that using your powers and demonstrating the use of your powers will give you more case to be able to shape that framework is really crucial. And I'd just like to tee up David a bit. The National Audit Office, the Environmental Audit Committee in the House of Commons, and the Committee on Climate Change have all acknowledged how important local climate action is if we're going to be able to reach our targets. That seems to be a growing body of evidence that Whitehall can no longer ignore, and therefore needs to be addressing properly in terms of the way that it changes those policy and regulatory frameworks.
If I can come in, I think there's a huge role for place-based solutions in terms of what actually are we going to do to reduce emissions. People talk about local area energy planning. Actually, what is the place-based solution that's best for the local area? Now, clearly, London has more powers in that regard than most parts of the country. But still, I think there's not only the technical side of that, what are we going to do where within London, and how does that all fit together, but there's a public engagement side of it as well. Actually, what say do London's people have in that process, in those decisions? But not only that, how are we going to engage with the public more widely to ensure that take-up of those climate solutions that already exist? I mean, almost all of what we're talking about in terms of getting to net zero, the solutions already exist, right? So what we need is, yes, the supply chains to deliver them, but also the demand from the people to actually say, yes, we want to take this action. We have, I would say, I mean, Polly talked about the 80% of people who, you know, this is not the main thing for them. I think it's really important to acknowledge that. We have a situation where, you know, all of the surveys and polling that we've seen over the last year or two, half of people in this country do not understand that their gas boiler helps to contribute to climate change. I mean, that is the starting point that we have. It's difficult for me as a professional in this area, and I'm sure difficult for everyone around this table, to understand how far back many people are. And so I think just engaging people and for them to understand what the situation is, what the changes are that are going to need to be made, what their potential role in it is really important. And I think that has to have a place-based element, both because community is so important in terms of spreading these messages, but actually also because local authorities can be a trusted agent here in terms of actually bringing everything together and making sure that everything's pulling in the right direction. So yes, there's a role for national government in terms of a public engagement strategy and getting those messages out there much more, but I also think that has to have a strong local dimension, and I think that is a really important priority for the next 2 or 3 years.
Thank you. I think just to come back on that point, obviously about people not perhaps understanding the contributions that their gas boilers make, for example. Do you think there's a real communications problem? I think there's to go from central to regional to local governments about where we get emissions, because, for example, I think there is most people understand that cars and planes and transport has a big impact on our air quality and emissions. But there does seem to be a lack of understanding around how, for example, the food, meat and dairy, as well as, wood burning ovens, as Assemblymember Bukhari brought to our plenary not long ago, and gas boilers. So is it a real communications problem? So part of that dialogue, perhaps not just around funding, but what we're talking about that could educate people.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think, look, this is not trivial. There is not one cause of climate change, and it's unreasonable to expect people to naturally just know about it without it being taught in schools for decades in order for them to understand. So, there's a process that people have to go through. I think there are many people who say, well, I do my recycling, I'm doing my bit, and yet recycling is only a small bit of actually what needs to be done. But they just genuinely don't understand the scale of changes that are required. Now, all of those changes are deliverable. They're all achievable. But people just don't understand what's needed because, frankly, we haven't done enough as a community of politicians, experts, and so on to communicate actually what the changes are that will be required. And the later we leave that, the more danger we are in then having to change people's lives in a way that really does disrupt and anger people and undermine the transition. So the earlier we can get to that point where people understand what needs to be done and they can do that in an orderly fashion in a way that makes sense and creates the jobs and the supply chains and all of that, the better. And I think we are quite far back actually from the general public really understanding all of the changes. They might understand bits of it, right? They might understand I need to fly less and I need to cycle more, etc. But they probably don't have the full picture. And I think it really is incumbent on us as a community to educate people and to give them the information and the tools and the options to actually contribute to this.
Thanks, David. And absolutely, I think that's the real takeaway from this on diversifying the message, especially from the GLA and what we can do on that. So a final question on this section from me that I've got written down, but I do have a follow-up, if that's okay, Chair, is to ask again to both of you. London sets its own carbon pathway via the Mayor, but how do we best consider that pathway against the overall budget for the country?
I'll have a go at that, but it's not an easy question to answer. I mean, essentially, for the national pathway, we now have both, a net zero strategy from national government plus the Climate Change Committee's own pathways for how net zero can be achieved nationally. Now, some bits of that don't really apply to London. So, what's going to happen in the agriculture sector? Well, yes, the demand side is important. It's important what Londoners eat, but realistically, we're not going to have many agriculture emissions in London to worry about. But I think we can take the relevant bits from those national level pathways and say, well, okay, that's a starting point for London. Now, can we do any better? And I think there's a range of areas where, London probably can go further and faster, whether that's on travel demand, whether that's on some of the other things we've talked about in terms of developing the supply chains earlier than the rest of the country and really going for it in terms of the retrofit of buildings. So I think, they're useful starting points, but I think you then have to understand the London-specific situation. I understand that there's new analysis that will be published in the new year that has looked at, what are the pathways for London specifically that I'm sure will be pretty aligned with national pathways, but maybe identify some opportunities for London to go further and faster in order to meet the more ambitious goal that London has. So I don't think there's anything magic that London has as an option that the rest of the country doesn't, but I think it can set an example as well. London has more powers than other cities in the UK, and the more that London can get on with it and show that those powers are really helpful, the more that other cities will start asking for those powers and that we can get accelerated delivery of this.
Lilli, did you want to come in on that at all, or no?
I don't think so. I think David's best on budgets, really.
Okay. Well, just a final follow-up, if that's okay, which was going to be for you, Polly, because I did raise this earlier in the meeting, and I think this may perhaps be cross purposes for you, given you've already stated you're a Hackney councillor as well. But from the UK 100, have you done any work with the 7 councils of the North London Waste Authority around the Edmonton incinerator, the contract which is due to be signed this Thursday?
No, we haven't. Not as UK 100, no.
Okay, and as UK 100, do you see the concerns with that? Are you worried? Do you think there's something we could have done on leadership to speak with them?
No, I don't. I think, to be honest, what we see with what's happening in the decisions that a lot of our members make is within the existing rules. And what is interesting about what we see with the North West London authorities, the North East Waste Authority, whatever it is, I can never remember the acronym.
North London Waste Authority.
North London Waste Authority, thank you. Is that there is a significant that there isn't actually an alternative that reduces emissions. This is the best technology that is available, and I think what also is important is to pay tribute to the efforts of Enfield in not only making sure that there is the lowest possible emissions from this incinerator, but also that they are using the waste heat to reduce to tackle fuel poverty and to create a heating network, district heating network there, which will also eventually benefit some of the residents in Haringey and Hackney as well. I think what's really easy is to say, oh, we don't like this, and that's it. The important thing about decision makers is that they have to make decisions. And they have to make decisions with not only the available technology, but also within the rules as they currently exist. And as far as I understand it, with the North London Waste Authority and the incinerator, and also the innovations that have been made by Enfield, is that they are doing as much as is possible to keep the emissions down. The alternative would be more landfill, which would be disastrous for everybody.
The alternative wouldn't be more landfill, probably because there's actually a surplus of 900,000 tonnes of incineration capacity being created across London as a result of this incinerator. And I do think that's slightly concerning. I think that was more, forgive me for saying this, but the answer from perhaps Hackney's Cabinet's position on this than perhaps UK 100, because from a climate perspective and campaign groups, from us, those of us that are worried from an environmental perspective, there are so many things to be worried about with Bedminster and incinerator. So I'm disappointed. I think that would have been a real opportunity for the UK 100 to liaise with these councils that are about to sign up to this on Thursday. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Can I just go back just before we do our final section on transport? President Obama recently, in his discussion with the Instagrammer Jack Harris, was talking a little bit about what you were saying there was this tiny group that were kind of climate deniers, and there was a bigger group that were just trying to pay their bills and rent and feed their family, and then a core group who were kind of green activists. He said the smallest group, the climate deniers, we just need to beat them. He said the middle group, which is the majority of the population, he said he really feels like things are changing though, and that they are learning maybe not fast enough, or they are getting more involved, or they are caring more. I'm just wondering briefly if that was your impressions too, and if there's anything we can do to make people care more, which we've been alluding to, but is there anything specific?
My response tends to be, I don't need more people to care, actually. Because I think mostly what we want is for it to be as easy as possible for people who have got other things to worry about, for this to happen without or with as minimal disruption to their lives as possible, and with increased benefits. And I think it's important to see it in relation to decision makers who have got other decisions to worry about. Local authorities, for example, their statutory duties are to vulnerable children and adults. They don't even actually have a statutory duty to collect the bins, but it's to vulnerable children and adults. If you're a social worker who suddenly gets told that you're using a dirty car to go around between jobs, why is somebody wanging on about climate change when actually you've got to be dealing with really vulnerable children all day, and the only place where you feel safe is taken away from you because you need to use a car club? That's why we need to be making sure that we design things with people's lives in mind, and that those families who that social worker is supporting doesn't have to worry about the bills, whether that's their energy bills or their food bills, in order to be able to afford them, let alone whether they're doing the right thing with climate. And so I think that's why it's incumbent on decision makers to make sure that it is as easy as possible for people to do the right thing, rather than spending more time making sure that people are worried about it. Yes, of course, awareness is really, really valuable. And the more people get aware of it, the easier it is to be able to change those behaviours. But for a lot of people, there will always be more to worry about than this, because they're pressing needs of today about getting to the end of the week are the ones that we have to help them with. And that's why I think it's important for us to understand there is a lot that the system can do to change that doesn't need to disrupt people's lives.
Thank you, Polly. And David, just to come to you on that same question, presumably though, if people are living, with floods or various effects of climate risks, I take everything Polly said, but I do think we'll see increasing effects right here in the UK of people, climate kind of going up their priority list. Do you think there's, just any response really?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's natural. As you say, as we see increasing impacts, of course, people become more concerned and more interested in what they can do about it. But I think it's not just that, people see what's happening around the world. It's not just living with the impacts ourselves. It's actually seeing what's happening globally with the forest fires and the floods and all of that. So, yeah, of course, we would expect increasing concern, and hopefully that can turn into increasing engagement with those opportunities to reduce emissions. But as Polly said, it's up to us as policymakers to make it as easy as possible for them to take those opportunities.
Thank you both. We're going to turn to transport now. I'm going to go back to Assembly Member Best.
Thank you. And yeah, no, I just want to say thanks for those comments from Polly as well, just on I think that's exactly where we're coming from with the expansion of the ULEZ, which has still thrown up a lot of issues and continues to for, like say, those most vulnerable in our society and charities. So, and that's exactly what we're getting to, where we need to, have different options for people, but not force it on the pocket of those that are poorest in London. So coming to you, Lilli, just wanted to start off by asking what role does TfL play in delivering and supporting the London Environment Strategy?
Yeah, thank you. Let's make sure. Did it?
This one.
Yeah, there we go. Good morning. Thank you very much for the question and for having me along this morning. So Transport for London, I think, plays a key role in helping deliver the London Environment Strategy alongside other functional bodies, but in particular because we are one of the largest integrated transport authorities in the world. We are an extremely large landowner. We own over 6,000 acres of land, 6,500 buildings. We are the largest consumer of electricity in London. We are extremely mindful of what our environmental impact is. And therefore, we have a sort of key role not only in the strategic policies that we can implement in London, such as the ultra-low emission zone, but also through our direct operations and the management of those assets that I talk about. And the LES, the London Environment Strategy, and the Mayor's Transport Strategy do form two really key twin sort of poles, if you like, that we direct the organisation at. They are translated directly into our corporate scorecard. They are used in terms of how we drive decision-making within the organisation. And the very clear targets and goals that are within those strategies, particularly around transitioning to zero carbon, which is now, and always has been actually in terms of the rail network, to be a zero carbon railway by 2030, but also to achieve other goals around recycling and better use of environmental assets. They are driving the way we operate the business every day. And we obviously have challenges. I'll probably come back at many points today to talk about finance. As I speak to you, we are in an interim period where we have no future firm funding agreement with central government, and that will inevitably impact on the speed with which we can deliver against those goals. But the commitments and the direction and the ambition of the organisation remains absolutely firmly tilted at that direction and implementing that strategy, and there's no wavering from that.
Thanks, Lilli. And what other plans does TfL have in place with regards to sustainability?
So obviously, so much. If we start the actual day-to-day operation, what we deliver is a sustainable transport network for London. If I look back 20 years, around half of journeys were made by cars in London. Over that period, we've now shifted that so that nearly 2/3 of journeys are made by public transport. And you'll all be familiar with the ultimate goal by 2040 of shifting to 8 out of 10 journeys being made by sustainable modes. So when we look at that, we know actually just on the trajectory we've come so far, we're avoiding 1 million tonnes of carbon being emitted in London every year. We are the sustainable transport solution for London, and that really is at the heart of what we're trying to deliver across the cities, to enable people in all their lifestyle choices that we've been talking about, to be able to make choices which allow them to travel in zero carbon ways. And we have been making really good progress on that. We recently published our sustainability plan, and that was published in September. And that captured not only that work that we're doing, but also how we sort of embed that both through the environmental outcomes, which I'm touching on, but also economic and social outcomes. And there is a lot on both of those other elements, whether it's through, we spend over £6 billion through the supply chain every year. And we follow the GLA's responsible procurement strategy within that. And with the transition that we've mapped out to have a zero carbon bus fleet, to transition all of London Underground's energy consumption on the railway to renewable energy, we have a really massive impact, both on the economic side, where that development will take place, but also in terms of reducing the environmental outcomes. And I could go on and touch on some of the other sort of more social outcomes that we help deliver through both enabling access to the city for all Londoners, but also through direct schemes such as our apprenticeship scheme and our different ways of allowing groups to enter into work. So we really put sustainability at the heart of what we do. We've just relaunched a vision which is to be the strong green heartbeat of London, and it is about actually really driving a sustainable recovery of London. And we detailed a lot of that in the recent sustainability plan, and we'll continue to track progress on that and report to you in terms of how we're doing. That there is a long way to go. And I think if I look at some of the biggest environmental aspects, obviously around carbon, it would be on that transitioning our 9,000 bus fleet. We already have the largest electric bus fleet in Western Europe, but we know that on current trajectory, we could get to zero carbon bus fleet by 2034, but even that's in jeopardy in terms of the current funding. And we do need to let those contracts for the electricity procurement to make sure that we're making that transition. Those, in terms of our direct operations, will hit that sort of 70-80% rule that we were talking about. And then there's a lot more in the detail to follow through to really meet the full range of targets that we have. I hope that helps. I can go into more detail if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you. On that, just ask, are you on target to obtain the 300 extra zero emission buses by the end of 21-22?
So currently we are, so we are in negotiations with central government to secure a funding deal. On the basis that that deal is secured, we would be looking to reach, I think, 800 electric buses by March of this year. Until we have a funding deal, I can't guarantee that that will happen. And indeed, as we've made very clear in our discussions with the Finance Committee of late, that we obviously didn't get the outcome we wanted from the comprehensive spending review, which would mean that ultimately we would need to move to what we call our managed decline funding scenario, which would slow significantly the procurement of future buses and would put in jeopardy meeting these targets that I'm talking about.
Okay. Your climate change targets included a risk assessment of all assets by the end of 2021. Has that been completed? And if so, which were the biggest climate risks from that?
So I'm not entirely familiar with exactly the way you phrase that that goal, but what we are doing is we are undertaking another sort of second phase of the comprehensive flood risk assessment of London Underground's assets to prioritise understanding of the most high risk assets from flood risk in particular. That is commissioned underway. We are producing an adaptation strategy that was following sort of internal look at where our risks are. So this is a very sort of live area of research and planning within TfL. The adaptation strategy we are due to complete by June of next year. And obviously that will summarise both where we understand our asset risks are, where the highest risks are, and also to put in place plans to address those and to ensure that we are as resilient as we can be in terms of current understanding of extreme weather events and climate change.
So the asset risk assessment won't be completed at the end of this year?
So I just would need to get from you just a bit more detail as to which we have multiple assets. So I'm not exactly sure whether you're referring to the London Underground asset or the surface transport asset. I'm very happy to follow up in correspondence just to ensure that we give you the full information you're seeking there.
Okay, I was just aware that there was the climate change targets for TfL, and one of that was to include a risk assessment of all assets by the end of 2021.
Okay, well, look, let me follow up because there's, for example, we're in the middle of just about submitting to DEFRA our adaptation power reporting, which does again look at where we are in terms of that, and that information will be public. But make sure that we get you the right information that can help you, help answer that question.
Okay, thank you. And finally, how is the Mayor's transport strategy linking into the delivery of the London environment strategy?
So it's sort of fundamental to that, both in terms of, if you think of direct carbon, obviously transport represents about 20% of carbon emissions in London, but obviously the role of the Mayor's transport strategy goes much wider than just addressing the transition to zero carbon in terms of helping to deliver more livable places and communities that people actually want to live in. So the goals of the sort of objectives and targets that I mentioned at the beginning that form the heart of the Mayor's transport strategy to deliver that modal shift to sustainable modes, to transition to zero carbon forms of transport, to ensure that London's air quality is cleaned up, to provide ways that people can travel in ways that benefit their public health. All of that flows from the Mayor's transport strategy, and as I said from the beginning, directly informs the way that we shape and prioritise our operations and our capital investment. So to bring that to life a little bit, obviously we have just delivered the second phase of the ultra-low emission zone, which you've referred to. If I look at some of the benefits from that, back in 2016, over 2 million people lived in areas of air pollution exceedance. That's down now by 94%. So it's reduced absolutely massively as a result of the various policy initiatives that have been put in place in recent years. With active travel, we've seen a really significant increase in active travel. Just in the period of 2020, there was a 45% increase in cycling in London, and that will deliver public health benefits. We have, however, seen public transport rallying as we came out of the pandemic, but again, it's very vulnerable to the current pandemic we're in, and we are at risk of a car-led recovery, particularly if we end up having to withdraw or reduce services as a result of lack of funding. So I would say that what I'm trying to paint a picture is that we really did use both the London Environment Strategy and the Mayor Transport Strategy to corporately drive us. And that will sustain, but the ability to continue to make progress on that is vulnerable to funding and also to the vagaries of the pandemic, which do continue to impact very, understandably on people's transport choices.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, I think it would be remiss, you hasn't mentioned finance several times. Do you know how much the government has bailed out, given to the TfL so far over the pandemic?
Yes, so up until now, I mean, generally we've talked about TfL having received around £5 billion in public support to sustain services throughout the period of 2020-2021.
Excellent. So I think it's fair to say that the government have been there to support TfL and will continue to do so. And I think they are waiting on solutions from both TfL and the Mayor in order to continue to do so, because you'll be aware, obviously, London isn't the entire of the UK. The government does need to look at how TfL is going to work as well with the government to avoid, just continuously relying on billion-pound bailouts all the time. So I do hope that obviously you come to the table with some solutions there. Because I've seen, and for example, Paul Scully's made clear there won't be a situation in which passengers are left with tubes and buses being cut. So I think it's completely scaremongering, to be honest, to keep on going with the line. And I think just before I finish up, I just wanted to ask on the ULEZ quickly, because I did try and ask Shirley Rodrigues earlier, the Deputy Mayor, and I wondered if perhaps obviously something that's really key and you mentioned avoiding a car-led recovery, is that we make sure that we improve the access to public transport in outer London, where there is no alternative at the moment for a lot of journeys. Out of the approximately £130 million spent on the implementation of the ULEZ, I was told a section of that money was going to be spent, or was being spent, on improving access to public transport. Can you detail what that was?
Yeah, I'll give you the information as I understand it. Just in your first point, though, I would say that TfL is obviously in discussions with government and has put a lot of ideas on the table, as the Financial Sustainability Plan published last January laid out and made clear. So we are extremely grateful for the government's support for London and for keeping transport services to date. The ultra-low emission zone, as I understand it, there was a lot of engagement of London boroughs around the boundary in terms of what additional measures could be helpful to communities. And that did result in additional, mainly requests actually around walking and cycling schemes, which were delivered via the Healthy Streets schemes. And that was, from my understanding, that is generally where the level of investment was directed, as well as obviously all the other additional support in terms of electric vehicle charging, which has gone on, and through the subsidies and the scrappage schemes, which I think you talked about with Shirley earlier, which obviously helped different audiences transition out of dirtier vehicles. There has also more generally been an uplift in bus services in outer London. So there's been 7 new bus services in outer London. They weren't delivered directly as a result of ULEZ, but as a result of more of the broader strategy, the Mayor's transport strategy, about improving accessibility in outer London. And obviously that brings some additional transport capacity and accessibility in those areas.
That's really helpful. Is there a spreadsheet or something with that information that you can send me, which schemes have been funded and where?
Yeah, happy to follow up in writing.
Report on to me. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move to Assemblymember McCartney in a moment. I believe Assemblymember Bukhari has a very brief question. Yeah. Also to say to Polly and David, even though all these questions are for Lilli, please do indicate if at any point you want to speak.
Thank you so much. I am leaving very shortly. So a quick question about charging points that have been installed by TfL during 2021. And, could you just give us a little bit of an update on that? What are your plans for installation for 2022? And to what extent is TfL relying on the increased provision of rapid charging points solely on the private sector? And what assurances can you provide that these will ensure a rapid switch to the use of electric vehicles by taxis, private hire companies, bike vehicles, car clubs, small businesses? What are we doing to support that area? Thank you.
So the whole EV charging. So there is obviously been the draft EV charging strategy for London published earlier in the autumn, outlining where sort of future direction would need to go. And it is a massive uplift that's required in London. London does outpace the rest of the country in terms of charging. There is around, I think, over 8,800 or something is the current level of on-street charging. However, I think it will need to be about 4 to 5 times that amount to meet what the strategy is actually talking about. So delivery to date in terms of rapids has been strong. As you know, the original proposals to deliver the 300 were delivered early. There's now work that's being incorporated in that strategy, which is working with other GLA partners to look at the ability to partner up with both private but also to use our land and to look at where that could enhance capacity. And as I understand it, I think there's plans for looking at around 1,000 additional charges, but that's not say funded. It's looking at what the potential is. The final strategy is due out very shortly, so we'll share that with you, and I hope that would give you all the detail that you would require.
Thank you very much, and thanks for your patience, Assemblymember McCartney.
Yes, thank you, Chair. My question's for Lilli. Broadly, how is Transport for London working on climate-related delivery? And then secondly, how is TfL itself adapting to climate change? And have you the policies in place to build the necessary resilience?
Thank you. So on the first point, if I understand that more from the strategic point of view in terms of how we're looking at climate-related delivery, that I would sort of cite the work that we do very broadly with other partners across the GLA family, but also particularly with the Mayor's team and what it means for London as a whole. So the work that I think Shirley, I wasn't there for her entire evidence, but I think she referred to work that's due to be published in the new year, looking at the trajectory to 2030. So obviously we've been closely involved using our transport models and the information that we can provide to give a scale of the challenge that transition would mean for wider transport use within London beyond our direct operations, so for individuals in car use. And we also obviously help support the analytical work that the GLA do in that through the London Atmospheric Emissions Index. So through that, basically, it's a sort of a policy support and into working very closely, basically, so that when that work is published, it's really clear how it addresses transport alongside the other climate challenges that London will face with that 2030 goal. In terms of our own direction, we've obviously, and a lot of this is captured in the corporate environment plan, have a clear transition plan to try to be zero carbon by 2030. As David was saying, that is extremely challenging to do to the every last bit, but what we know where the real big wins are and where we're really working very closely to secure broader government support is around the transition of the bus fleet, which would be the largest source of our carbon emissions. And we have a roadmap to do that. And obviously the work that I've talked about a number of times, which is around transitioning our electricity consumption on the London Underground to renewables through power purchase agreements. And the first new build power purchase agreement is due to go out post-Christmas. So the delivery is largely mapped out there. We also are undertaking a carbon baseline of all our buildings. I mentioned earlier that we have 6,500 buildings. And, there's a lot of work to do here. We're not in a position where we should be, I don't think. We need to know exactly what that baseline is to be able to prioritise and identify where we can improve carbon delivery. And then when I was last with you, we talked a bit about flooding and resilience. And obviously, there's this work in parallel that I've touched on with Assembly Member Best about understanding better our risk positioning and being able to ensure that all of our resilience plans for London Underground in particular, but also the road network, are focused on being climate ready, and whether that involves identifying where enhanced drainage or pumping may be required, or asset resilience on the train, the embankments or other elements of the railway network. That's the kind of work that is underway and would be captured by that adaptation strategy or adaptation plan that I mentioned is due out in the summer.
Thank you. It seems to me that TfL has a very close relationship with local authorities in particular, often working on joint projects, and often they rely on funding from TfL for many of their transport work too. So can I ask, how can TfL use your power, your knowledge and your links to actually help decarbonise London? And it may be with local authorities, it may be with other stakeholders. And are you looking at that in the future about what you can do, whether it's about how you procure, how you share knowledge, or anything else?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And we obviously have extensive stakeholder relationships, whether they're with boroughs, which are indeed very strong, and we share a lot of information and work very closely with London councils on most recently, for example, as part of the Task and Finish group on surface water flooding, where we're looking again at those risk elements and how we understand climate risk for London in that. But, you know, there is, so there's, if I just pick out a couple of examples. So within the functional bodies, for example, we are working jointly to look at this, not only procuring renewable energy for ourselves, but how we could do it for the wider GLA family, so that all of the functional bodies could transition easily to renewable energy, and leveraging off what has been quite a technical know-how journey that we've gone on to be in a position to be able to undergo such procurements. What was that? I was going to say something else. Yeah, and the other elements, again, are around electric vehicle infrastructure in terms of working, again, with the functional bodies around how we could use our land holdings to make available land for really releasing land for electrical vehicle infrastructure. But yeah, I've gone slightly blank. Sorry, I can't remember the rest of what I wanted to say.
That's fine. I was going to ask Polly, given that you operate a network of sharing best practice, organisations like TfL and other GLL functional bodies, do they have a key role in the work you're doing?
Yes, they do. And what's interesting is when we have conversations with our members, particularly about tackling the decarbonisation of transport and the associated issues around air quality and so forth, is that quite often they will say, well, what we would like in our transport authority is the same powers as TfL. And it's quite often the private sector that say, why are you being so unambitious? Think big, think you might need actually something different. But that coordinating power is really important. And I'd go to a particular point that Lilli was just mentioning in terms of EV charging points, because I think, and it goes to the discussion we were having earlier about people's lack of understanding of what's required or what actually causes the problem. It's also a lack of understanding about how the energy system works. And I don't expect anybody to start to become an expert in the energy system. What you want to be able to do is to switch the light on, heat up your home, and not worry about it costing a packet or costing the planet. But the reality is that a lot of the emphasis, or a lot of the challenges around EV infrastructure is not about TfL, and it's not necessarily about local authorities. It's about the distribution network operator, which is, in your case, in London, UK Power Networks. And again, the regulatory obligations and incentives on them to be able to provide power for you, to be able to put your EV charging points where you want them. And so what you'll find is local authorities will say, well, we'd like half a dozen EV charging points, please. Can we have them outside the train station or something? And the DNO will say, well, it'll cost you. And they give a price and they go, well, we can't afford that. And so, well, you can do them around the corner in the dark where nobody goes, at the end of where we've got a bit of spare capacity. And then, desperate to demonstrate that they want to be able to have some EV charging points, they put them in, nobody uses them, they get demoralised, no further EV charging points get put in. That situation is not the same now as it was when people first started, but the point about needing to have strategic cooperation between big organisations like TfL, big players in the energy system, and people who have got decision-making powers over their communities, be that metro mayors in other parts of the country and the mayor here, and metropolitan boroughs and district councils and county councils, is essential, because without that, we'll end up with decisions that aren't really designed around the communities which they're supposed to serve. And that's really important for TfL's knowledge and understanding, particularly their analysis of data about how people move around the city, where they might move around the city, things around the changes of moving around as a consequence of the pandemic, helps local authorities and the energy players to start talking together about where that resource needs to be. So I can't emphasise enough how important it is to have strategic transport authorities who have decarbonisation absolutely at their heart, and with good, strong relationships with London boroughs, as well as with whoever the constituent boroughs or constituency authorities, as well as whoever is the democratic elected leader who's got some kind of responsibility for that transport authority.
Could I just come in on the financial aspect that Polly raised about the distribution companies and the charging points and so on? I mean, it's really important to recognise that electric vehicles are not just good for the climate and for air quality. They're also going to save us money, right? Running electric vehicles is so much cheaper than running petrol cars. that even ignoring tax and everything else, they're just going to save us money. And so these financial barriers that the distribution companies say, well, it will cost you, we're saving money somewhere else in the system. And that's so frustrating in terms of joining these things up to actually say, well, overall, this would still have saved us money, but because you put a barrier in front of putting the charging points in the right place, there are going to be fewer charging points in the places where we need them, fewer electric vehicles running, and ultimately it costs us not only environmentally but also financially. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that, and it's certainly not just TfL or anyone around this table that can solve that. But I think the more that we can find ways of actually getting the charging points in the right place and getting the financial incentives so that everyone wants to do the thing that needs to be done, rather than some parts of the system saying, well, it's not in our interest to offer you this opportunity. I think that's really important.
And just to say, I mean, as I was mentioning, the Mayor's Electrical Vehicle Task Force is again one of those convening strategic opportunities which seeks to bring those different partners together to get that sorted out at the strategic level.
Yeah, but presumably, as Polly was saying earlier, a change to the regulatory framework might actually help as well.
Yeah, no, it would, but at least those people, such as UK Power Networks, are part of those conversations early on and upfront, and realising the sort of strategic importance. So through dialogue, you can sometimes overcome some regulatory shortfalls, but not all of them.
I would recommend you take evidence from Ofgem and UK Power Networks at some point in the future about how they see their role in being able to facilitate this, particularly the fact that this isn't just about transport. As soon as you start electrifying a place with the strength that we're talking about in a digitalised, decentralised, smart way, you are much more able to meet your decarbonisation ambitions on heat and energy efficiency and other uses for power.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Lilli, can I just pick up that I think you said that there's an adaptation report due June next year. When will you be publishing the report for DEFRA?
So we are currently looking to publish the first part of that. So this year, DEFRA was looking at having a spreadsheet, detailed spreadsheet analysis, which we've discussed with them, and that element will be later in the spring. But the first part of the report will be published, should be published before, I think just after Christmas, but very shortly.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And David, we were just talking about electric vehicles there. Something I was really aware of in COP was my worry about technological solutions being too much of the answer. I was wondering if you could comment on, ultimately, surely we need to be reducing traffic on the road as opposed to changing vehicle usage.
Yeah, that's really important. So, I mean, a few things to say. One is, on the air quality side, we don't think electric vehicles are as good as cycling, for example, for air quality, because there's still pollution that comes from the tyres, even if you completely make it a zero carbon aspect. I think there's a question of timescales as well. So how quickly can we get to a completely zero carbon transport fleet in London? Well, you have to, if you're going to wait till the end of life of a petrol or diesel car to replace it with an electric car, then, well, that builds in potentially an extra decade to the transition. If you can, whether you keep your car or whether you join a car club or whatever it is, but switch to mainly cycling, then you don't have those sort of emissions continuing to occur until the end of vehicle life. And I mean, as has been talked about, it's not just around the carbon emissions, it's also around the place-based transition, actually making it a more pleasant transition for people, not just in terms of air quality, but also, the lower congestion, lower traffic, noise, etc. I mean, I live in Hackney, and the low transport neighbourhood scheme has been great since the pandemic, and I understand it's been kept now in my area, and that's just really good. It's just a nicer place to live as a result. So I think, you can get support for the climate transition from many of the residents by also making it a nicer place to live, and some of these non-EV aspects are important. But of course, there are always going to be people who still want to own a car, still want to drive their car, and so we need to make it easy for them to switch to an electric vehicle, but it can't be the whole answer.
Thank you, Lilli.
Can I add something?
I can't jump to Lilli because I saw an indication, and I'll come to Polly.
Yeah, so I think I really like that point, and I think it's just, it couldn't go, I couldn't let it go by as the safety officer as well without mentioning that, you know, electric cars are still quite capable of running over and killing people. So in our transition to a Vision Zero city where no one is injured, what we really know from the low traffic neighbourhoods and stuff is that they have had fantastic reductions in people being injured and killed in those areas. And this is that's sort of the beauty in the transport strategy, is it's a multiply reinforcing approach, whereas, you know, if we can reduce traffic and ensure that the vehicles that are there are safer and cleaner, overall you'll get more people walking and cycling. So we really should remember that this transition is actually saving people's lives and actually really driving down the number of people who are being killed and injured on our roads every day. So it's a really important part of the goals that we're focusing on as well.
Thank you, and Polly.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that I'm particularly pleased that the Committee on Climate Change is shifting away from a solely technologically driven approach on these things, because what I was particularly concerned about was that I could see sort of a technology shift without an acknowledgement of existing policy solutions, which might well make a difference, most particularly public transport. Now, obviously, London's public transport system is a jewel across the country, and nowhere else has anything quite as substantial, which means so many people can feel comfortable about moving around the city without a reliance on a car. And almost everybody who lives in London who doesn't spend any time on public transport outside of London gets shocked when they find out how much money it costs to get in and out of any town. And therefore, basically, if you're on minimum wage, you're spending at least the first hour of your working day just paying your bus fare, and thinking that that is a sensible way of going about it. So affordability is really important, as well as the electrification of your public transport. But I would also say it's got to be reliable, it's got to be safe, and you've got to be designing your community so that people feel comfortable about walking to and from bus stops. There is nothing more likely to deter people, particularly women who are more likely to be using public transport, of using that public transport if it feels unsafe. And the kind of innovations that we've seen in TfL that have made that public transport feel more safe and is comparatively much more affordable than anywhere else in the country and is increasingly reliable are the kind of innovations that actually might not be as swizzy and exciting as an electric vehicle, but are actually the meat and drink of proper local decision making, which can really make a difference. But again, national rules on franchising, on subsidy, on control of routes, and all of those things need to be changed if we're going to have that kind of transformation across the country.
Thank you, that's all really helpful. And for our final section, Assembly Member Devonish.
Thank you, Chair. Lilli, can I ask you to give short, succinct answers, as the time is rushing on, but thank you for all your evidence. How does TfL view the financial aspects of meeting the Mayor's 2030 targets, given the draft GLA Mayor budget note that private investment will be needed to meet them? And what actions is TfL now taking within its own budget to deliver on the Mayor's environmental aims, please?
So, can you just say the first bit about again, because I didn't quite.
How does TfL view the financial aspects of meeting the Mayor's 2030 targets, given the draft GLA mayoral budget note that private investment will be needed to meet them? And what actions is TfL now taking within its own budgets to deliver on the Mayor's environmental aims?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to make sure I fully heard that. So within the context, obviously, that we have no settled funding status at the moment, the approach that we, as you know, we're working to secure that funding deal with the government currently. But within the 2030 target, obviously, what we've said in the current budget, obviously, is that we would need to slow down in terms of the elements such as procuring buses. So we know overall what the overall approach is that we need to take, and that's set out in our financial sustainability plan, which was published last January. But within the current budget, obviously, we are looking at having to slow down on that implementation because we wouldn't have sufficient funding to do it in full. Nevertheless, and I think it's something that's really important for my teams internally as well, that there is much that we do in our day-to-day decisions in terms of maintenance and renewals of assets, in terms of how we manage our assets, that will ensure that we do continue to make progress through energy efficiency, through better care, sort of basically ensuring that in all of the work that we do, that we are prioritising environmental efficiency and safe resources. But in terms of the big capital spend, and I would highlight buses, is that there would be an impact. Nevertheless, in other elements I've talked about, such as the moving towards the renewable energy procurement, the current plan is that we would continue to progress with that. It's extremely important that we secure longer-term, affordable and sustainable energy supplies. So that is work continues currently. And obviously, you have I think there's a further session this Friday where the whole budget is going to be scrutinised. So there'll be more detail available then.
Okay, thank you. What does TfL expect to do once the Mayor's updated zero carbon pathway is published? And specifically, TfL is committed to agree a set of reduction targets for Scope 3 emissions, including the supply and value chain emissions, as well as emissions from vehicles by the end of 2022. Will you just publish a target for this overall, or will it be specifically include reductions from certain sources like road traffic?
Okay, so 2 questions. The first one, in terms of what will we do once the pathway towards 2030 is published. So to some degree, in terms of TfL operations, we already are ahead of the game insofar as our existing targets were already to 2030 to run a zero carbon railway and to transition our head office buildings and operations. So the work and understanding of what is broadly needed has been mapped out and is captured in the corporate environment plan, and would, as far as funding enables us to do so, would continue. So, but obviously what I think you may be sort of pointing out is that 2030 target is significantly different in terms of wider transport use within London, particularly private car use. And if that work suggests that there's a different approach to managing traffic, obviously as the Transport Authority, we have a key role to play in helping shape policy options around that. And we'll be working closely with the Mayor's office on that. All of the work that we do, though, in terms of supporting sustainable transport choices should be aimed at helping people make a carbon-friendly transport choice, so that whether it's through the bus service, whether it's through walking, cycling, or working closely with London boroughs to make streets feel safer and be more attractive to walk on, and that will remain as part of our focus. In terms of Scope 3, obviously we have set that date to set out the way forward on that by the end of 22, and I don't think we've actually decided exactly how we're going to set the targets within that, so we'll definitely come back to you once we have. Okay,
thank you. My final question: when a zero carbon target for 2030 is considered, which emissions are in scope for that? You're probably going to refer me to your last answer.
Yeah, so and I'm not sure what Shirley said to you on that, but we are obviously within our current approach within TfL, obviously we're looking at scopes 1 and 2, which is why we need to do the work on scope 3. For the broader piece of work being brought forward by the Mayor, yeah, I'll leave that to them to come forward with.
I'll leave it there, Chair. Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all our guests. That is the end of our question and answer session. Thank you very much for your time and contributions. They were incredibly helpful. And of course, thank you to the Deputy Mayor in the previous session. We still have a few more items to deal with, so please feel free to leave the room whilst we deal with those, or you can stay for the riveting bit that we're about to do. The committee is recommended to note the report as background to putting questions to invited guests and note the subsequent discussion, and delegate authority to myself as chair in consultation with the deputy chairperson and party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting. Can we agree the recommendations? Thank you very much. Environment Committee work programme. The committee is recommended to note its work programme. Can we agree the recommendation? Thank you. Date of next meeting. Absolutely. Noted. For those who can't hear, because I don't think a mic was on, Assemblymember McCartney suggesting that we take up the idea of energy, and the chair agreed. Date of next meeting. The next meeting of the committee will take place on Monday, 27th of January 2022 at 10 a.m, hopefully at the Crystal, but who knows. May I speak on behalf of the committee to wish Scrutiny and the committee staff a big Merry Christmas or happy whatever you're celebrating. And on that, there is no other urgent business. Thank you.